Hey there, and welcome back. If you are settling in now, lights low, the day finally letting go of you, then good. Tonight's story is one of those that wants you exactly where you are, still, quiet, ready to let your mind drift across 700 years and into another woman's senses. The smell of beeswax candles in a parish chapel, the cold of stone window seats in a winter palace on the Seine. The salt wind off Boulogne harbour on a January morning in 1308, when she was 12 years old and being married to a king. The lit halls at Westminster, the marsh air at Castle rising in the long Norfolk evenings of her last years. All places that belong to one woman, across one life, that we are going to walk through together tonight. Before we go in, I want to know where you are listening from. I love reading those comments. Wherever you've put yourself for tonight, leave it in the comments below. And if you've not yet subscribed, do that now. Every subscriber helps the channel grow, and tonight's life is the kind of life this channel was built for. Her name has survived 700 years. Most people have heard it. Few people know the actual shape of what she did. She was a daughter of one king of France and a sister of three more, a wife of one king of England and a mother of another. She was married to a man who preferred other men to her for almost 2 decades. She left him, she took a lover, she raised an army. She landed at Orwell in Suffolk in the autumn of 1326 with about 1,500 soldiers, and within 10 weeks she had brought down her husband's regime without a battle. She ruled England for 4 years, and then her own son took the country back from her and sent her to a Norfolk castle, where she lived another 28 years in comfortable quiet, reading her books, watching her grandchildren grow up, surviving almost everyone who had shaped her century. She has been called many things across those 700 years. Most often, by far, the she-wolf, a name no one used in her lifetime, and one she would not have recognized. Tonight, you are going to live her life with her, from the first hour to the last. I want to give you a sense of the world she was born into, because so much of what she later did is the consequence of where she began. She was born around 1295, in Paris, into the dynasty that was, at that moment, the most powerful royal house in Christendom. Her father, Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, or Le Bel, ruled France from the Ile de la Cite, the small fortress island in the middle of the Seine, where the kings of France had kept their palace since the dynasty began. Imagine that island for a moment, the Sainte-Chapelle, only 50 years old at her birth, its impossible blue-stained glass already famous across Europe. The royal palace itself, a complex of halls and chambers and chapels, in the heart of a city whose population had passed 200,000 and was the largest in northern Europe. Philip IV was a king who had picked fights with the Pope, broken the Knights Templar, debased the currency, and frightened most of his neighbours. The court he kept was the court she was raised in. It was rich, it was ceremonious, it was watched by every other crown in Europe, and it was the centre of her early world. The people who will move through her life are mostly names you will recognise. Her father, Philip IV, the Iron King of France, who shaped her childhood. Her mother, Joan, Queen of Navarre in her own right, who died when Isabella was about 10. Her 3 brothers, Louis, Philip, and Charles, each of whom became King of France after their father, each of whom died without a surviving son, and whose collective ending in 1328 would give Isabella's own son his claim to the throne of France, the claim that would set off the 100 Years' War. Her husband, Edward II of England, a tall, handsome man with the muscles of a labourer and the personality of someone who genuinely did not want to be king. Piers Gaveston, his Gascon favourite, the man Edward, loved in a way the chroniclers tried very hard not to write down clearly. The Despensers, father and son, who would replace Gaveston and accumulate one of the largest private fortunes in 14th century England, much of it stolen. Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, the Marcher Lord who would escape from the Tower of London, find Isabella in Paris, become her lover, lead her invasion, and rule England with her until her 17-year-old son had him hanged at Tyburn. And the son himself, Edward of Windsor, who became Edward III at the age of 14 and reigned for 50 years, one of the greatest of all English kings, the man who broke the French at Crécy and founded the Order of the Garter, and who never publicly spoke a word against his mother for the rest of her long life. These are the figures whose paths will cross hers, repeatedly, sometimes briefly, sometimes for decades. You will know them the way she came to know them. Some of them she would love, some of them she would destroy, some of them she would survive into a quiet old age. Neither of you would have predicted at the beginning. Settle in now, the fire is built up. The bed curtains are drawn. The Paris of Philip the Fair is waiting. The cold of late autumn already in the stone of the palace, on the Isle the river, running grey under the windows. A child is asleep in a chamber on the upper floor. The women of her household around her in the dim. The candles have burned down. Outside, the city's bells are quiet for the night. This is where she begins. This is the room she opens her eyes in. Let us go. Paris in the 90s. The cold of the palace stone never quite leaves the lower rooms. Even at the height of summer, the great hall on the riverside keeps a damp ecclesiastical chill that the servants warm with braziers in the corners and never quite cure. The Ile de la Cite is a fortress. 3 centuries of building and rebuilding have made the royal palace at its western end into a complex of linked structures. The Great Hall, the Sainte-Chapelle, with its impossible windows, the kitchens running along the riverside, the women's apartments on the upper floors, the long corridors with their carved stone springers, and their tapestries that move when the door at the far end opens and the river wind catches them. Outside the palace walls, the Seine. Beyond the Seine, the city narrow streets, timbered houses leaning towards each other across alleys, so narrow that 2 horses cannot pass abreast. The smell of wood smoke and butchery, and the river and the bread ovens of a city of 200,000 people, the largest concentration of human beings between Constantinople and Cairo, all of them turning in some way around the king on the island in the middle of the river. This is the city she is born into. We do not know her exact birthday. The royal records of the period are good, but not perfect, and the births of daughters were less precisely noted than the births of sons. She was probably born in the spring of 1295 in the women's apartments of the palace on the Ile, attended by the midwives of the French court and by the women of her mother's household. Her mother was Joan of Navarre, Queen of France by marriage and Queen of Navarre in her own right by inheritance. A small kingdom in the Western Pyrenees that her family had ruled for generations, which she had brought to her husband as her dowry. Joan was by all accounts the most competent person in the marriage. Philip IV trusted her with affairs of state. She acted as regent in his absences. She founded the College of Navarre at the University of Paris, which would remain one of the great medieval colleges of France. She was literate, educated, and possessed of a will of her own. Isabella would later be described in similar terms, and the source of those qualities is not far to seek. Isabella's first years are the years of a royal nursery on the upper floors of the palace. The household around her is large by modern standards and tiny by the standards of her later life. A wet nurse, several women in attendance, a confessor assigned to her religious education, the women of her mother's household passing in and out at intervals through the day. The room she sleeps in is warm enough by careful management of braziers and shutters, though the corridor outside is cold, and the chapel for the morning office is cold, and the lessons in the schoolroom are cold. Winter in Paris in the 1290s is not the gentle winter of modern climate. The Seine froze in some years deeply enough for carts to cross it. Snow lay on the rooftops for weeks. The candles burned more hours of the day than they were lit. The wind found every gap in the window leads, and a royal child grew up understanding that warmth was a thing produced by human labour and never to be assumed. She is taught to read in French and in Latin. Her education is unusually substantial for a girl of her rank, and the indications across her later life, her surviving letters, her capacity to debate theology and law, the books she had with her at the end of her life in Norfolk, suggest that she received from her mother and her tutors something more than the bare ornamental literacy that some princesses of the period got. She would have been taught the Psalter as her first book, as nearly every literate medieval child was, and she would have memorized long stretches of it. She would have been taught Latin grammar through the standard medieval textbooks. She would have been taught French composition, the lives of the saints, the genealogies of her own house going back to Hugh Capet, and the duties of a queen. She would also have been taught, and this is where her mother's hand is most visible, that a queen was not merely an ornament to a king, but a person with her own affairs, her own household, her own council, and her own role to play in the politics of her realm. Joan of Navarre had been queen in her own right of a small kingdom in the Pyrenees, and she did not raise her only daughter to think of queenship as decorative. She had 3 brothers. Louis, the eldest, 3 years older than her, was the heir. Philip and Charles followed. The 4 children grew up in adjacent apartments, with the kind of shared early life that royal siblings either turn into a lifelong bond or treat as an irrelevance. With Isabella and her brothers, the evidence suggests it was the former. Louise would write to her affectionately after her marriage. Philip would intervene on her behalf later in life. Charles, the youngest and the last to be king, would be the one who received her in Paris in 1325 and refused to send her back to her husband against her will. These were her brothers, and they would matter to her across decades. The man who ruled the household and the kingdom from the lower floors was her father. Philip IV of France was not an easy man. The chroniclers, even the ones who admired him, found him difficult to read. He was tall, fair, handsome in a cold way, almost wholly silent in council. His ministers ran much of the day-to-day government, and his queen ran much of his private life. But the will behind both, when it descended on a matter, was iron. He fought the Pope. He won. He fought the Templars. He won. He devalued the coinage of France when he needed money, and survived the riots that followed. He married each of his 3 sons to heiresses of substantial inheritances, and he negotiated, for his only daughter, a marriage that would tie the crown of France to the crown of England and end, he hoped, 2 centuries of Anglo-French wars over the Duchy of Gascony. The negotiations for Isabella's marriage began when she was about 3. The proposal was that she would marry the young Edward of Caernarfon, son of Edward I of England, the formidable Edward Longshanks, the conqueror of Wales and hammer of the Scots. The marriage was meant to settle the long quarrel over Gascony, where Edward I held lands as a vassal of the French crown, but resented the homage owed for them. In 1303, the Treaty of Paris-Montreuil was signed, and Isabella, aged about 8, was formally betrothed to a prince she had never seen. Her bridegroom was 19 at the time of the betrothal, 11 years older than her, and was already known to his father's court as a young man whose interests did not run in the directions his father had hoped. He liked rowing on the Thames with the boatmen at Windsor. He liked thatching cottages with his servants. He liked his Gascon companion, Piers Gaveston, who had been raised in his household from the age of about 13, and who was now, at 19, his closest friend and the recipient of most of his affection. The English court was already concerned about this, and the king his father was sending Gaveston abroad with some frequency to break what was beginning to look like a problem. The bride who had been promised to Edward of Caernarfon was 8 years old and living in a palace on an island in the Seine. The betrothal was politics. The marriage would come later, when she was old enough to be married, which in the medieval royal usage meant about 12. The years between the betrothal and the marriage were the years in which her mother died. Joan of Navarre died in April 1305, when Isabella was about 10. The cause is not known with certainty. Some chroniclers reported poisoning, others a long illness. But the result was the same. The household Isabella had grown up in was diminished by half. Her father did not remarry. The royal nursery, with its tutors and its women and its careful routines, continued, but the centre of it was gone. Isabella, at 10, inherited a measure of her mother's role in the household and was treated by her father, in the years that followed, as something closer to the senior lady of his court than as a child. She attended ceremonial functions. She received ambassadors with him. She learned, in a way that few girls of her rank ever did, how a court actually worked from the inside. The years between her mother's death and her marriage were the years in which her education was most concentrated and her father's attention was most directly on her. Joan of Navarre had been the person who supervised Isabella's daily life. With Joan gone, Philip took over that supervision in a manner that few medieval fathers of his rank troubled to take. He did not relegate the work to a chamberlain. He visited the nursery. He examined his daughter on her Latin grammar and her catechism. He had her brought to him in his cabinet after the morning council, and asked her what she thought of the ambassadors who had appeared that day. He treated her, in short, as a kind of apprentice in the trade of being royal. The chronicles do not record this directly, because the chronicles did not pay much attention to royal daughters. But the consequences are visible in everything Isabella did later. She did not learn the politics of a court by accident. She was taught. Her father in these years was at the height of his power and the height of his strange isolation. The chronicles describe him in language that is unusual for the king of any medieval European realm. He was silent, he was watchful, he spoke seldom in council and was obeyed without question. He had a way of looking at a man, his courtiers reported, that was hard to bear. His enemies, who included 2 successive popes, found him impossible to negotiate with because he would not engage in the give and take of diplomatic conversation in the usual way. He listened. He went away. He returned with a decision. The decision was final. The man who had broken Pope Boniface VIII in 1303, who had bullied Pope Clement V into moving the papacy to Avignon, who had ruined the bankers of Lombardy and confiscated the property of the Jews of France in 1306, was a person Isabella watched closely over these years and from whom she learned, perhaps more than from anyone else, what it looked like to govern by patience and inflexibility combined. She also learned what it looked like to govern by terror. In October 1307, 3 months after Edward I had died in the north of England, and 4 months before Isabella was to be married, her father did the thing for which his reign is most remembered. He arrested the Knights Templar. The Templars were the great military order of Christendom, established in the Crusades, possessing branches in every Christian kingdom, holding lands and treasuries that made them the richest religious corporation in Europe. They were also, by 1307, deeply indebted creditors to whom Philip himself owed substantial sums. The arrests were carried out on the morning of Friday, the 13th of October 1307, simultaneously over the whole of France, by sealed orders that had been distributed to every royal officer the previous week. The Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, who had been in Paris for the funeral of Philip's sister-in-law, was arrested in his bed at the Temple in Paris that morning. Several thousand Templars were taken into custody over the kingdom on the same day. The charges, which had been carefully assembled by Philip's lawyers over the previous year, included heresy, idolatry, sodomy, and a series of other offences that justified the seizure of all the order's property pending trial. The trials that followed, conducted over the next 7 years under torture and with predetermined outcomes, would result in the dissolution of the order, the burning of its leaders at the stake on an island in the Seine in March 1314, and the transfer of its estates to the crown of France. Isabella was 12. She was in Paris. She was being prepared for her marriage. The arrests took place in the same city in which she lived, and were the great topic of conversation in every chamber and corridor of her father's palace through that autumn. She would have been told what was being done. She would have known the men being arrested, some of them, the senior Templars, who had served at her father's court, were people she had seen at functions. She would have understood the official explanation that the order was diseased and required to be cut out of the body of Christendom. She would also have understood, because no one in her position could have failed to understand, that the actual reason had to do with money and power, and that her father was doing a thing that was outside the ordinary scope of medieval royal action. The arrest of the Templars was not a routine act of state. It was a coup against an institution that the rest of Europe regarded as untouchable. It succeeded because Philip the Fair was the kind of man who could carry through an action that the rest of Europe regarded as impossible. Isabella, watching it from her chambers in the palace on the Isle, took the lesson. The lesson was not simply about violence. It was about the political handling of an act of overwhelming force. Philip did not invade the temple in Paris with armed knights. He sent royal officers with sealed warrants. He did not justify the seizures publicly with reference to the financial debts he owed to the order. He justified them with reference to canonical offences that the Church itself would have to investigate. He did not announce the action in advance. He announced it after it was complete, and in such a way that the action appeared to be already complete and irreversible. He combined the use of legal process, the manipulation of religious sentiment, the seizure of assets, and the management of public information in a single integrated operation. He was, in essence, conducting a campaign rather than a raid. The campaign would unfold over 7 years, with each stage carefully prepared, with the Church gradually brought into alignment with the Crown's purposes, with the order's defenders systematically eliminated. Isabella was 12 when she watched the opening move of this campaign. By the time it was complete, in 1314, she was 19 and Queen of England, and she had absorbed an entire grammar of political action that would surface 18 years later, in the equally careful campaign she would conduct against her own husband. But that is later. In the autumn of 1307, in the palace on the Isle, she is 12, and her father is arresting the Templars, and her marriage trousseau is being prepared in the women's apartments, and she is in the middle of an education that is preparing her for things she does not yet know she will need to do. Her religious training continued. Her chaplains heard her confession daily. The Sainte-Chapelle, just over the courtyard from her chamber, was the chapel in which she heard Mass on the great feasts. With the candles lit on the altars and the morning sun coming through the windows that her great-grandfather St. Louis had built, she learned the genealogies of her family, the line of the Capetians from Hugh Capet, the line of the Dukes of Burgundy, the line of the kings of Navarre through her mother by heart, as every royal child was expected to do. She learned the formal etiquette of the French court, which was elaborate, and watched her closely. She learned, from her uncles, the men of state, whom she would later need to recognize, across Europe, the cardinals, the bishops, the great barons of France, and the German lands and Castile and England. She learned how to give an audience. She learned how to refuse one. She learned the long thousand small skills that fitted a girl of her rank for the role she had been promised since the age of 3. She was 12 in the summer of 1307 when the news came from England that the old king there had died. Edward I had ridden north to crush the Scots one final time, and had died at Berg by Sands within sight of the Solway Firth. His son Edward of Caernarfon was now Edward II of England. The marriage, postponed for years, was suddenly imminent. Isabella's father moved quickly. The papal dispensation was obtained. She and her bridegroom were related within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity, as nearly all European royals were. The dowry was assembled. The marriage was set for the following January at Boulogne, and Isabella, who had been a betrothed child for half her life, was now 12, almost 13, on the eve of becoming a queen. Late autumn 1307 in the palace on the Ile. The candles burn long into the evenings now. Her women are at work on the marriage gowns. The trunks are being prepared. There are conversations in low voices in adjacent rooms. There are gifts arriving from her uncles and cousins. There is, in the household of a 12-year-old being prepared for marriage to a foreign king, a kind of bright, sad energy that everyone has felt before, in different forms, but no one quite names. She is leaving. She is leaving the only world she has known. The brothers she grew up with, the Sainte-Chapelle with its impossible blue, the river through the windows, the cold corridors and the smell of beeswax. None of these will be hers any more. She is going to England, to a husband she has never seen, to a court whose language she speaks, but whose people she does not know. She is 12. She does what she has been raised to do. She prepares. She prays. She submits. The marriage party left Paris in early January 1308, in the dead of winter, riding north through Picardy towards the Channel coast. The journey took about 10 days. The roads were frozen hard. The retinue was enormous. Her father, her brothers, her uncles, the great officers of the French crown, hundreds of attendants, the wagons of her dowry, the chests of plate and linen and jewels, the gifts for the English king. They reached Boulogne in mid-January, and there, on the high ground above the harbour, in the church of Notre Dame on the cliff, the wedding was held on the 25th of January 1308. 5 kings were present at the wedding at Boulogne. Her father Philip IV of France, her bridegroom Edward II of England, 23 years old, 6 feet tall, fair-haired, dressed in cloth of gold for the ceremony. Albert of Habsburg, King of the Romans, who had travelled north from his German lands to attend. Charles of Naples, an uncle by marriage, and the King of Navarre, who was Isabella's eldest brother Louis, 16 years old, and already a king in his own right through their mother's inheritance. 5 crowned heads at a single wedding was a thing the chroniclers of the period thought worth recording. It was understood as a statement of how much the French court valued this marriage. The bride was 13. She had turned 13, or close to it, by the time the wedding took place. She wore a gown of blue and gold. The chronicler Geoffrey of Paris, who was there, described her as the beauty of beauties, and the formula was conventional, but the consensus of the chroniclers across her life suggests it was also accurate. She was, by every account, an unusually handsome young woman. The wedding was held in Notre Dame de Boulogne, the church on the cliff above the harbour, looking out over the grey channel towards the kingdom she was about to enter. The ceremony followed the standard form. The vows were exchanged in French, the language of both courts. The mass was said. The dowry was formally transferred, 21,000 livres in cash. The renunciation of any further claim to the county of Ponthieu through her mother, a quantity of jewels and plate sufficient to furnish a queen's household. Edward made his own settlement on his new bride lands in England that should generate her dower income. The assignment of certain wardships, the customary dower of a Queen of England. The financial side of the wedding was negotiated with the precision of a treaty, because in a sense, it was a treaty. The personal side of it, the side that mattered to Isabella, was harder to read. She was 13. He was 23. He had been told for years that he was going to marry this girl. He arrived at Boulogne with Piers Gaveston in his retinue. He behaved courteously. He performed the ceremonies, and then the wedding party crossed the Channel together, embarking at Boulogne on the 2nd of February and landing at Dover 3 days later, after a winter crossing rough enough to remember. Dover, the white cliffs, the grey sea, the harbour below, full of the ships that had carried the bridal party across. The English court waiting on the quayside, Isabella, on the deck of her ship as it came in, would have been seeing her new country for the first time. The cold of the February air, the wind off the Channel, the faces of the English court above her on the quay, in their winter cloaks, their breath visible in the morning air. She steps off the ship. She is now, formally and finally, Queen of England. She is 13 years old. She has been married for 11 days. And here is the moment that the chroniclers all record, and that historians have been arguing about for 700 years. Her husband, Edward, who has come down to the harbour to meet her, walks past her, embraces Piers Gaveston, kisses him on the mouth, and calls him brother. The chronicler, who recorded the scene, was not a hostile witness. He was reporting what he saw. The greeting at the quayside in Dover, when the King of England met his Queen for the second time, and his favourite for the first time after a 6-month separation, was a public statement that the favourite came first. Isabella, on the quay, in her wedding finery, watching, was 13 years old. She had been raised by Joan of Navarre and trained by Philip IV. She did not, by every account, make a scene. She greeted her husband when he turned to her at last, with courtesy. She greeted Gaveston with courtesy. She allowed herself to be conducted up from the harbour to the lodging that had been prepared for the night. And she wrote, that evening, or the next day, the first of the dispatches to her father that would punctuate the early years of her marriage. The dispatch is lost, but its existence is recorded, and the gist of it can be reconstructed from her uncle's subsequent furious behaviour. She had told them what she had seen. The court progressed slowly from Dover to London over the following weeks. The progress through Kent and into the city was a series of formal welcomes, the burghers of each town meeting the new queen at their gates, the gifts of wine and plate, the carefully assembled processions. By the 3rd week of February, the royal party was at the Tower of London, where it was traditional for an English monarch to lodge in the days before a coronation. The coronation itself was set for the 25th of February at Westminster Abbey, a month exactly after the wedding at Boulogne. The coronation was the second public humiliation in 2 months. Edward, who had the right to arrange the ceremonial of his own crowning, chose to have his crown carried into the abbey, not by one of the great hereditary officers of the realm. The earls, who by ancient custom performed this office, but by Piers Gaveston. Gaveston wore royal purple. He had been raised to the earldom of Cornwall the previous summer, an English earldom that had been reserved for the king's own kin since the Norman conquest. He walked into the abbey, head of the Queen of England, carrying the crown of Saint Edward the Confessor on a cushion of cloth of gold, dressed more richly than any Earl of England, and the English barons in the procession watched him do it with expressions that the chroniclers recorded for posterity. Isabella's uncles, the brothers of her dead mother, the great French magnates who had escorted her over the Channel as their family duty, watched him do it from their places in the procession. After the ceremony at the coronation banquet, things became worse. The feast was poorly organised, the food was late, the seating was wrong. Gaveston was seated next to the king where the queen should have been. The arms of England and the arms of Gaveston had been displayed together on the tapestries of the hall where the arms of England and the arms of France should have been. The Queen's uncles, Charles of Valois and Louis of Evreux, walked out of the banquet in the middle of the proceedings and returned to their lodgings, and then returned to France within the week, and carried with them to Paris a report so blistering that the relations between the two crowns were damaged for years. Isabella was 13. She had been Queen of England for 1 month. She had been twice publicly slighted in favour of her husband's favourite, in front of the assembled courts of both kingdoms, and she had borne it with the composure of an adult. The dispatches to her father continued. She told him, in some detail, what she had seen and what she was being denied. Her father's response was a careful diplomatic protest through the proper channels, accompanied by private fury that he stored against future use. She was not yet able to protest publicly herself, and she did not try. She was a 13-year-old queen in a strange country whose senior nobleman had spent her wedding month treating her as an inconvenience. What she did instead, in the early weeks of her marriage, was begin the long, quiet work of establishing herself. She set up her household. She received the women who would attend her. She received the chaplains assigned to her service. She inspected the dower properties that had been settled on her at the marriage, and began to understand in detail what she had been given and what was being withheld. Edward had, in fact, withheld substantially. The lands that should have been hers under the marriage settlement were partly held back on the grounds that they were not yet available, that the previous holders had not yet vacated, that the administrative arrangements were not yet in place. Some of them were lands that Edward had given, in the meantime, to Gaveston. Isabella noted this. The dispatches to her father continued. The French crown noted it. The matter would be raised repeatedly over the next several years in increasingly direct language. But for the first months of her marriage, Isabella did what she had been raised to do. She established her household, learned the English court, made what allies she could among the English barons who shared her view of Gaveston, and waited. The household she set up in those first months was the foundation of everything she would do over the next 19 years. By tradition, the Queen of England had her own establishment, separate from the king's, financed by the income of her dower properties, and managed by her own officers. The senior officer was her steward, who supervised the running of all her houses. Below him were the chamberlain of her household, who controlled access to her person and her chamber, the keeper of her wardrobe, who managed her finances and her stores, the marshal, who managed her stables and her movements, the cofferer, who kept her accounts. Beneath these officers were the ranks of her ladies-in-waiting, her women of the bedchamber, her damsels, her chaplains, her clerks, her cooks, her grooms, her huntsmen, her musicians. By 1310, when her household had been fully established, it numbered between 100 and 200 persons, depending on the season and the location, and it consumed about a third of her dower income in salaries alone. The dower properties themselves were substantial, when she was allowed the full benefit of them. They included the manors of Eltham in Kent, Marlborough in Wiltshire, Devizes also in Wiltshire, Knaresborough in Yorkshire, Cookham and Bray in Berkshire, and a long list of smaller estates over the southern counties. She had the income of several boroughs. She had the right to certain customs revenues from the wool trade. She had the lordship of Pontefract, which produced a substantial income from its honour. The total notional value of her dower, by the calculations of the chamber, was about £4,500 a year, a sum equivalent in real terms to a great earldom and more than the income of any other woman in England. The trouble in the early years was that Edward consistently diverted a substantial portion of this income to other purposes. Gaveston received the lordship of certain Queen's lands. The Exchequer was instructed by the King to delay payments to her receivers. The expected income was, in practice, often 2/3 or less of the notional. She protested, through her officers and through her French connections, but she did not get satisfaction until she was a great deal older and a great deal stronger. She spent her time, in the early years, moving between the principal royal houses on a cycle that the Queen's household kept independently of the King's. Eltham was her favourite house from the beginning. It was a green palace southeast of London, on the high ground above the River Thames, with a moat and a great hall and apartments looking out over the gardens, and it became, over the years, the house she returned to when she had the choice. She kept her own permanent chamber at Eltham, with her own furniture and tapestries, which she could leave in place rather than moving them between residences. She kept her own chapel at Eltham, with her own chaplain and her own ornaments. She kept her own gardens at Eltham, which she had improved with new walls and new plantings paid for from her wardrobe accounts. When her children were small, they were kept at Eltham more often than at any other house, and she visited them when her duties permitted. The English queens before her had treated Eltham as one of several seasonal residences. Isabella treated it as her home. Her work as queen in the early years was substantially diplomatic. She was the principal channel of communication between the English crown and the French. Her father expected her to report. Her brothers, after their father's death, expected her to report. Her uncles, the great magnates of France, who had been at her wedding and who took an active interest in her welfare, expected her to report. The dispatches went out from her chamber to Paris on a regular cycle. They were carried by her own messengers, drafted by her own clerks, sealed with her own privy seal. Edward sometimes saw them and sometimes did not. The English diplomatic service knew of them, but generally did not interfere, because the Queen's correspondence with her family was an established right, and because the information she sent was, on the whole, the same information that the English ambassadors were sending in their own dispatches. Over the years, she became one of the principal sources of intelligence between the two crowns, and her interventions on specific questions were often decisive. She was the person who arranged the visits of French embassies to England. She was the person who entertained them when they arrived. She was the person whose presence at the audience permitted certain matters to be raised that could not otherwise have been raised. She was, in the working political sense, an ambassador permanently resident at her husband's court. She also developed, over these years, the relationships with the English clergy that would prove important later. Walter Reynolds, who had been Edward's friend and tutor, was made Archbishop of Canterbury in 1313. She cultivated him. Adam Orleton, the abrasive canon lawyer, who would later be the architect of her husband's deposition, was made Bishop of Hereford in 1317. She cultivated him. Walter Stapledon, the Bishop of Exeter, who was treasurer of the realm under the Despensers, and who would later be murdered by the London mob in 1326 because of his association with that regime, was at the beginning of his career a man whose advice she sought and whose company she enjoyed. The English bishops, like the bishops of any medieval kingdom, were political figures as much as they were ecclesiastical ones, and the Queen, who cultivated them across years of patient acquaintance, developed a network of clerical contacts that would, when the time came, supply the legal theology of her invasion. Her religious life over these years was conventional and apparently sincere. She kept the standard observances of a noble lady of her rank. She heard Mass daily. She kept the great fasts. She made pilgrimages to Canterbury most often, to Walsingham occasionally, to a number of smaller shrines on the route between her properties. She corresponded with the great abbeys of France. She gave alms with the regularity that the household accounts record. She founded no new religious houses in the early part of her queenship, but she patronized existing ones, and the specific saints she favored, Saint Louis, her great-grandfather, whose canonization she had been a child for, Saint Thomas of Canterbury, the great English saint, the Virgin in her aspect as Our Lady of Walsingham, were figures her own household tradition had given her. The piety she practiced was the standard piety of her class. There is no evidence that she was unusual in it, in either direction. She was a conventional medieval royal woman in her religion, which is to say a person whose religious observance was woven into the texture of every day, and who would have thought it strange to think of it as a separate compartment of her life. This is the first lesson she had learned in Paris, in the household of her father and the late household of her mother, and it was the lesson that would carry her across her whole life. Patience was not weakness. Patience was the long-deferred work of arranging the ground for what was to come. She was 13, and she would be Queen of England for the next 19 years before she did anything anyone would later call dramatic. The patience that the chroniclers and historians would later describe as her great quality, the long capacity to wait, had been trained into her by her parents, and it was already operating in the early months of her marriage. She did not weep. She did not write to her father asking to come home. She established her household. She learned the country. She waited. The first crisis came quickly. By April 1308, less than 2 months after the coronation, the English baronage had enough. They had been preparing their position through the spring, and at the Parliament held that month, they presented to the king the document that became known as the Boulogne Declaration. It demanded the perpetual exile of Piers Gaveston from the realm of England. It accused him of leading the king into folly, of monopolizing royal patronage, of insulting the nobility, of squandering crown revenues. The document was signed by the most senior earls of England: Lincoln, Warwick, Pembroke, Hereford, and others whose support no king could lose. Edward refused. Parliament went into deadlock. The country drifted, through April and May, towards something close to civil war. In the end, Edward backed down. In June 1308, he agreed to send Gaveston into exile. The favourite was given the lordship of Ireland and dispatched to Dublin as the king's lieutenant. The English barons, who had wanted him sent to Gascony, or France, or as far away as possible, accepted Ireland as a workable compromise. Edward, who could not bear to have him further away, accepted Ireland as the price of avoiding worse. Gaveston left for Ireland with his English wife. He had been married the previous year to one of Edward's nieces, an alliance designed to embed him into the royal family, and he stayed there for a year. During that year, the king's misery was visible to everyone at court. He wrote to Gaveston constantly. He sent gifts. He pulled every diplomatic and political lever he could find to engineer the favourite's recall. By June 1309, with the help of a careful campaign of papal pressure and baronial bribery, Gaveston was permitted to return. He landed in England that summer, and Edward rode out to meet him. Isabella was now 14. She had been queen for a year and a half. In that time, she had learned more about the politics of the English court than most queens learned in their entire reigns. She had developed working relationships with some of the senior barons, particularly Lincoln, who was friendly to her, and Pembroke, who was a man of principle and who treated her with the courtesy her position deserved. She had managed her dower estates as best she could, though the income from them was less than it should have been because of Edward's interference. She had observed, with the focus of someone who had been raised to observe, how power actually worked in this country, and she had endured the second crisis of her marriage, the year of Gaveston's exile, with the public composure that was now her trademark. The years between 1309 and 1311 were years of escalating political tension. Gaveston was back. The barons were furious. A new programme of reform was being prepared. The ordinances, which would eventually be presented to the king in 1311 as a comprehensive restraint on royal power. The architects of the ordinances were a group of senior lords known as the Ordainers, led by Thomas of Lancaster, the king's first cousin, his nearest male relative outside the royal family, and a man who would become Edward's principal political enemy over the next decade. Lancaster was the wealthiest magnate in England after the king. He held 5 earldoms: Lancaster, Leicester, Derby, Salisbury, and Lincoln, the last acquired through his marriage. He had income, lands, retainers, and a settled determination to bring Edward to heel. Isabella, through this period, occupied the curious position of being the king's wife, and also, by the careful patient work of 2.5 years, a credible ally of the barons who were trying to reform him. She did not openly take sides. She remained Edward's queen, attended the major ceremonies, performed her diplomatic functions, and continued the correspondence with Paris that kept her father informed. But she was not, in private, an opponent of the Ordainers. She and Lancaster were on cordial terms across this period, and Lancaster, who had his own quarrel with Gaveston, including an insulting nickname Gaveston had given him, found in the Queen a person whose grievances aligned with his own. They were never close. They were never allies in the formal political sense. But she was not against him. And when, in the autumn of 1311, the ordinances were finally presented to the king, and he was forced to accept them, one of the provisions was the third exile of Piers Gaveston. Gaveston left England again in late October 1311. He went to Flanders. He stayed there for about 2 months. By Christmas, Edward had recalled him, in defiance of the ordinances and in defiance of every commitment he had made. The recall was unmistakable defiance, and the barons understood it as such. Lancaster, Warwick, Hereford, Pembroke, and others gathered their retainers in the early months of 1312. The king and Gaveston moved north, looking for support among the loyal lords of the north. By May, they were besieged in Scarborough Castle. By the end of May, Gaveston had surrendered to Pembroke under terms of safe conduct. Pembroke set off south with his prisoner, planning to escort him to his own castle at Wallingford, while Gaveston's fate was decided. On the way, somewhere in the Midlands, Pembroke left his prisoner overnight at a rectory and went off on a private errand. Warwick, hearing of this, rode out at dawn, seized Gaveston from his guards, and carried him to Warwick Castle. What happened next is recorded factually in the chronicles and need not be lingered on. Gaveston was held at Warwick for some days, while the senior lords debated what to do with him. Lancaster, Warwick, Hereford, and Arundel decided he should die. On the 19th of June 1312, he was taken out of the castle and conveyed to Blacklow Hill, 2 miles from Warwick, on land that belonged to Lancaster. He was executed there by 2 Welshmen of Lancaster's retinue. The execution was an act of judicial murder, dressed in the form of an execution under the ordinances, and the king understood it as such for the rest of his life. He never forgave Lancaster. He never forgave Warwick. He waited with the kind of patient hatred that only marriage to Isabella's husband seems to have produced, for the 10 years it took him to assemble the means to destroy Lancaster in his turn. But that is a later part of the story. For now, in June 1312, the favourite is dead and the king is in collapse. Isabella was in Yorkshire when the news came. She was at Tynemouth Priory, where she had been sent by Edward as he and Gaveston fled north, and where she had been left when they retreated further. The Scots, under Robert Bruce, were raiding in Northumberland, and Tynemouth was not a safe place for a pregnant queen. She was pregnant. The fact emerged in the records that summer. The conception had been at some point in the late winter or early spring of 1312, in the brief weeks when Edward and Isabella were together at court before the political crisis fully broke. She was 16, almost 17, and carrying her first child. Edward had not, by every account, been a particularly attentive husband during the pregnancy. He was preoccupied with Gaveston, then with mourning Gaveston, but he was concerned enough about her safety when the Scots threatened Tynemouth to send a small ship from Whitby to evacuate her down the coast to York. She made the journey safely. She rested for the remainder of the summer at York. By November, she was at Windsor. Edward of Windsor was born at Windsor Castle on the 13th of November 1312. The chamber was prepared as Queen's chambers had been prepared in England for centuries. The bed hung with linen, the floor strewn with fresh rushes, the windows shuttered, the fire built up against the November cold. The women of her household attended her. The midwives of the royal household worked through the long hours of the labour. The boy was born healthy in the early evening, weighed and washed, and presented to his mother. The bells of Windsor rang. The bells of London, when the news reached the city, rang for 3 days. The king came to Windsor. He saw the child. He was, by every account, genuinely delighted. He had been a poor husband, and would be a worse one. But the child was an heir to the throne, and he loved children, his own most of all, and the birth of Edward of Windsor was the first real consolation of his bereaved year. Isabella, in the chamber at Windsor, in the days after the birth, with the child at her breast in the long November evenings, with the women of her household attending her in the warm chamber, and the candles burning slow against the wall, with her body recovering from the labour, and her mind beginning to register what she had just done. She had given the King of England an heir, and the heir was hers, was 16 years old. She had been queen for nearly 5 years. She had endured public humiliation and private absence, and she had outlasted her husband's favourite. The political weather of the realm had turned in her favour. The king needed her in a new way now. The boy in the cradle changed everything about her position. She did not name him. The king did. He called him Edward, after himself and his father. But the boy was hers in the deeper sense, the one that mattered, and she would prove it over the next 18 years. The middle years of her marriage, the years between the birth of the heir and the rise of the Despensers, were the years in which Isabella came into her full work as queen. They were not happy years, in the way that we use the word now. But they were the years in which she was most effective, and in some ways, the years in which her marriage was at its working best businesslike, capable of producing heirs, characterized by a kind of mutual professional respect that the worst of what was to come had not yet driven out. The first task, in the months after Edward of Windsor's birth, was to broker the reconciliation between the king and the lords who had killed Gaveston. the king wanted vengeance. He wanted Lancaster and Warwick and the others tried for the murder of his favourite. The barons, knowing this, were assembling their retainers and preparing to fight. The country was, again, drifting towards open war. The man who prevented it was the papal envoy, Cardinal Arnaud d'Oc, sent by Pope Clement V to mediate. The woman who worked alongside him was the Queen of England. Isabella, 18 years old, with the child still in the cradle, was the principal back-channel between her husband and the senior barons over the spring and summer of 1313. She rode between Windsor and the great houses of the kingdom, carrying messages, smoothing tempers, finding the language that each side could accept. By the autumn of 1313, a reconciliation was reached. The Lords offered Edward a formal apology in his great hall at Westminster. He accepted it in front of the assembled court. The marriage between him and his barons was on paper restored. The marriage between him and his queen, after that summer of work, was at its closest. They went to France together that summer to attend a great festival held by her father. They were treated as a couple at the height of their partnership. Edward, in front of her family, was on his best behaviour. The chroniclers noted it. The peace did not last. Within months of returning to England, Edward was preparing the Scottish campaign that would become the catastrophe of his reign. Robert Bruce, who had been gathering strength steadily over the years of English distraction, had now reduced almost every English-held castle in Scotland and was besieging the last great one. Stirling had been garrisoned under an agreement that if it was not relieved by midsummer 1314, it would surrender. Edward, who had let Scotland slip year after year while he fought with his barons over Gaveston, decided that the relief of Stirling would be his great campaign. He called out the full feudal levy. He assembled the largest English army to march north since the wars of his father. He set out from Berwick in mid-June 1314, with perhaps 20,000 foot and 3,000 horse, and he met Robert Bruce at the small stream called the Bannock, 2 miles south of Stirling Castle, on the 23rd and 24th of June. What happened at Bannockburn was, by any measure, the worst military defeat the English crown had suffered in centuries. The English army was caught in difficult ground, harassed by Scottish schiltrons over the night of the 23rd, and then broken in open battle on the morning of the 24th. The losses were enormous. The Earl of Gloucester, the king's nephew, was killed. Hundreds of English knights were captured for ransom. The infantry losses ran into the thousands. The king himself, when the battle was clearly lost, was led off the field by his bodyguard and rode south at speed, abandoning his army, his baggage, and what remained of his reputation. He reached Dunbar Castle on the coast and took ship there, returning to Berwick by sea. The Great Seal of England was lost in the rout. The royal pavilions were stripped. The Stone of Destiny, which earlier English kings had taken from Scotland, remained, but everything else of any value that had gone north with the army stayed in Scotland, in Bruce's hands. Isabella received the news at Berwick, where she had been waiting with the king's baggage train. She had been carried north with the campaign, as queens often were, on the understanding that she would witness her husband's triumph. What she witnessed instead was his return as a defeated man, exhausted, frightened, ashamed. She received him at Berwick. She rode south with him through the wreckage of his campaign. She watched him try, over the next several years, to recover from a defeat that had broken something in him that would never be repaired. He had not been a confident man before Bannockburn. After Bannockburn he was, in many ways, a man waiting for the next bad thing to happen. And the next bad thing was not slow in coming. In November 1314, Isabella's father died. Philip IV of France, the Iron King, who had fought the Pope and broken the Templars and frightened all his neighbours, fell from his horse while hunting in the forest near Fontainebleau and died within days. He was 46. Isabella was 19. She had not seen him for over a year. Her eldest brother Louis succeeded as Louis V. The death of Philip IV had been expected by no one. It set off, over the next 14 years, a chain of dynastic catastrophes in France that no one had foreseen. Louis V was king for 18 months. He died in June 1316, at 26, of either pleurisy or poisoning, depending on which chronicle you believe. He left a 4-year-old daughter and a pregnant queen. The queen gave birth in November to a son, John I, who was crowned King of France in his cradle and died after 5 days. The next eldest of Isabella's brothers, Philip, was crowned Philip V in January 1317. He had 2 daughters and no son. He reigned for 6 years and died in January 1322 without male issue. The third of Isabella's brothers, Charles, became Charles IV. He had 3 wives and 3 daughters and no son. He died in February 1328. Within 14 years of her father's death, every male in the direct Capetian line was dead, and Isabella was the only surviving child of Philip the Fair. The implications of this, when they emerged, would be immense. But in 1316, when her eldest brother died and her second brother became king, the implications were not yet clear. What was clear was that the dynasty into which she had been born was undergoing a quiet shaking that no one quite understood the meaning of. In England, meanwhile, the household of the Queen was growing. John of Eltham was born at Eltham Palace in Kent in August 1316. He was Isabella's second son, named for the manor where he was born, a pleasant green palace southeast of London that had been one of her dower properties since the marriage. She loved Eltham. She spent more time there than at any other of her houses, and her children would grow up associating it with their mother. Eleanor of Woodstock followed in June 1318, born at Woodstock Palace near Oxford. 2 years later, Joan of the Tower was born in the Tower of London, where Isabella was lodged at the time. The 4 children were born across 9 years: Edward in 1312, John in 1316, Eleanor in 1318, Joan in 1321. The household around them grew accordingly. The nursery moved between Windsor and Eltham as the seasons and the politics dictated. The children were raised together for their early years, then increasingly with their own separate establishments as they grew. Isabella visited them often. She was, by every account, an attentive mother. The bond between her and her eldest son, in particular, would survive everything that her later life put between them. The English political weather over the years 1316 to 1318 was unsettled rather than catastrophic. Lancaster, whose victory at Bannockburn by default had made him briefly the most powerful man in England, had begun to overreach. He demanded the ordinances be enforced. He demanded the king's friends be dismissed. He demanded administrative reforms that the king's officials resisted. By 1318, a working compromise had been negotiated, again through Isabella's influence and that of the loyalist Earl of Pembroke. The Treaty of Leek, signed at Leek in Staffordshire in August 1318, returned the king to a kind of working relationship with his magnates under a standing council. It was not a settlement that Edward enjoyed. He had been forced into it by political necessity. But it held the realm together, briefly, while he looked around for the next favourite, who would replace Gaveston in his affections. The man he found was Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh Despenser the Younger was not, at first, an obvious replacement for Gaveston. He had married Edward's niece Eleanor de Clare in 1306, when Edward was still Prince of Wales, and he had been a routine member of the king's household ever since. He was English, where Gaveston had been Gascon, a fact that mattered less than later commentators would suggest, but mattered some. He was the son of an old royalist, Hugh Despenser the Elder, who had served Edward I and remained a loyal supporter of Edward II. He had been one of Gaveston's enemies in his youth, and had switched sides only when Gaveston's death made the switch possible. He was 33 in 1318, 4 years older than the king. He was sharp, ambitious, completely lacking in self-restraint, and possessed of one of the most acute political minds in England. He understood the king's nature better than any other man at court, and he understood, from his observation of Gaveston's rise and fall, exactly what could be done with the king's affections if a man approached them with sufficient cleverness. He was made royal chamberlain in 1318, the official who controlled access to the king's person. From that moment forward, every petition that reached the king passed through Hugh Despenser's hands, and every man who wanted favour at court had to pay Hugh Despenser for the privilege. The grants and revenues he extracted over the next 3 years were enormous. The lands he assembled, particularly in the Welsh marches through his Clare marriage, formed one of the largest private estates in 14th century Britain. The wealth he accumulated was substantially stolen, in the sense that it had been seized from his rivals through forced sales and trumped-up charges and outright violence, with the king's tacit support. And the king's affection for him deepened over these years into something that those who knew Edward best recognised as a return of the old pattern that had broken his reign before. Isabella watched all of this happen. She was now in her mid-20s. She had been Queen of England for over a decade. She had 4 living children. She had developed, over the years, the network of friends and informants and confidential servants that any working queen needed. She knew, before most people knew, what Hugh Despenser was doing. She knew which lords he was robbing, which widows he was defrauding, which Welsh marcher families he was trying to break. She knew, too, what his wife Eleanor was doing in her household, because Eleanor de Clare, who had been a courteous, if cool member of the Queen's entourage for years, was now reporting back to her husband everything Isabella said and did. The Queen's household had been penetrated. Isabella, who had developed an excellent feel for these matters across 2 decades, understood what was happening and adjusted accordingly. She said less in public. She wrote more carefully in her private correspondence. She continued to perform her ceremonial functions with the composure that was her professional standard. And she waited. The crisis broke in the summer of 1321. The barons of the Welsh marches, led by Roger Mortimer of Wigmore and Humphrey de Bohun, Earl of Hereford, had enough of Hugh Despenser's depredations. They rose in arms, burned Despenser estates through the marches, and demanded the favourite's exile. They gathered an army and marched east. Lancaster, watching from the north, indicated his support. By July, the king was being besieged in the Tower of London by the Earl of Hereford's army. Parliament was called. The Despensers, father and son, were sentenced to perpetual exile. Hugh the Elder went into Brabant. Hugh the Younger took ship and turned pirate in the English Channel, robbing merchant vessels for prize money, while he waited for the king to recall him. The king's humiliation was complete. It did not last. Edward, who had learned nothing from the Gaveston crisis, was already planning the recall before the ink on the exile order was dry. By October 1321, he had assembled a sufficient faction of loyalists, recovered enough money to pay an army, and identified a useful pretext for war. Queen Isabella, on a pilgrimage to Canterbury that autumn, was refused entry to Leeds Castle in Kent by its owner, Lord Badlesmere, who had joined the baronial party. The refusal was an insult to the king's wife. It was also, in retrospect, almost certainly a setup. Edward had sent Isabella to Leeds precisely so that the refusal would happen and give him casus belli. He gathered his forces, marched on Leeds Castle, took it after a 6-day siege, and proceeded to use the campaign as the opening of a full war against the Marcher barons. By November, he was in the field. By December, the dispensers had been recalled, the exile orders annulled. By January 1322, the king's army was driving the Marchers north and west. By the end of January, the two Mortimers, Roger of Wigmore and his uncle Roger of Chirk, had surrendered to the king at Shrewsbury and been sent in chains to the Tower of London. By March, Lancaster had been brought to battle at Boroughbridge, defeated, captured, and conveyed to Pontefract. What happened at Pontefract on the 22nd of March 1322 was the moment Edward II finally took the revenge he had been planning for a decade. Lancaster, his cousin, the man who had killed Gaveston, was tried in his own great hall at his own castle, with the king himself in attendance, on charges of treason. He was given no opportunity to speak in his own defence. He was sentenced to death. He was executed outside the castle, before a small crowd of his own retainers and the king's followers, on the same hill where his retainers had killed Gaveston's executioners 10 years before. The execution was a judicial murder, dressed in the form of an execution under the law. The king understood it as the closing of an account. The country, when the news spread, was appalled. Lancaster had been many things, and many of them not admirable, but he had also been the king's nearest male relative and the most senior magnate in the realm. To execute him in such a manner was to violate every convention by which the English political class governed itself. Edward, who had survived for 15 years by being more cautious than his enemies expected, had finally done a thing his enemies would not forget. For 4 years after Boroughbridge, the dispensers ruled England in the king's name. The Marcher lords who had rebelled were dead or imprisoned or in exile. Lancaster was dead. The ordinances of 1311 were revoked at the Parliament of York in May 1322. Edward II was technically the most absolute king England had since the conquest. In practice, he was a tool in the hands of Hugh Despenser, the younger, who used the king's authority to enrich himself, his father, and his connections on a scale that no English magnate had ever managed. The Welsh marches were stripped. The estates of the rebels were redistributed to the favourites. The crown's debts were paid off with confiscated lands and then accumulated again, at twice the rate, by new royal extravagance. The country was being looted openly by a small coterie centred on the Chamberlain, and in this looting, Isabella was now a target. The dispensers had identified, by 1324, that the Queen was the most dangerous remaining figure at court, who was not on their side. She had income from her dower lands. She had influence with the leading clergy. She had a developing relationship with her son, the prince that was, in their eyes, suspect. She had a brother on the throne of France, who could be relied upon to make trouble. She had to be brought to heel. In September 1324, the king, at the prompting of the dispensers, issued the order. Isabella's dower estates were sequestered into the king's hands. Her income was cut to a quarter of what it had been. Her French servants, chaplains, women, household officers, the people who had been with her since Paris, or who had joined her from France over the years, were dismissed and ordered to leave the country within a stated number of weeks. The custody of her 3 younger children was transferred to Eleanor de Clare. Only the eldest, Prince Edward, remained in her care, and that only because he was now 12 and old enough to be effectively past nursery age. The household that had been at Isabella's centre for 16 years was broken apart in a matter of weeks. The chamber was emptied. The chaplain who had heard her confession since her marriage was on a ship for Calais. The women who had attended her at her children's births were gone. The records of her revenues stopped reaching her because the revenues were no longer hers. The income she now received was an allowance set by the king's officials at a level the dispensers thought appropriate for a queen they no longer needed. She was 29 years old. She had been Queen of England for 16 years. And she had been, in the space of one autumn, reduced from being the most senior woman in the realm to being a kind of decorative dependent in her own court. The transformation was visible to everyone at court who looked. The dispensers, who had thought they were neutralizing her, had in fact done the one thing that her training, her patience, and her temperament had been preparing her for across the whole of her life. They had made her dangerous. The instrument of her revenge was a man she had never met. He had been brought to her attention some years before, in the casual way that important figures came to a queen's notice in the routine traffic of court information. He was a marcher lord. He held lands in the Welsh marches and in Ireland. He was a soldier of some reputation, who had served Edward I in Scotland and Edward II in Ireland, and who was thought to be one of the abler military commanders of his generation. He was about 10 years older than her, but around 1287, which made him just under 40 when she would finally meet him. He was married to Joan de Geneville, a Geneville heiress who had brought him substantial Irish lands and a castle at Ludlow. He had 12 children by her. He had, by the careful standards of the Marcher families, made a successful career. His name was Roger Mortimer of Wigmore. He had been one of the leaders of the 1321 baronial revolt against the dispensers. He had surrendered at Shrewsbury in January 1322 and been imprisoned in the Tower of London ever since. He had been sentenced to death, and then the sentence had been commuted to indefinite imprisonment, which Hugh Despenser the Younger had every intention of converting back to death at the first politically convenient opportunity. He had, in the autumn of 1323, decided not to wait for that opportunity. On the 1st of August 1323, the feast of St. Peter ad Vincula, the prisoners of the Tower had a banquet by old custom. Mortimer's guards, who had been carefully bribed, attended the banquet. The food was drugged. The guards fell asleep. Mortimer, who had been preparing the escape for months, climbed out through a hole in the kitchen wall that Confederates had been quietly enlarging, swam the Thames, met horses on the south bank, and rode for the coast. By dawn he was on a ship for France. By midsummer of 1324 he was at the court of Charles IV in Paris, an exile, a sentenced rebel, and a man with nothing to lose. His wife and 12 children were in English custody. His estates were forfeit. He was about 37 years old, in exile, dispossessed, and looking for any opportunity at all to recover what he had lost. In the early months of 1325, the diplomatic crisis between England and France that had been brewing for years came to a head. Edward II owed homage to his brother-in-law, Charles IV of France, for the Duchy of Gascony, as every English king had owed homage to every French king for the same lands since the 12th century. Edward did not want to go to France to perform the homage in person, because he feared, with some justification, that he would be detained there until he agreed to French terms on a range of other matters. The French, in response, declared Gascony forfeit and sent in troops. The English administration in Gascony collapsed within months. Bordeaux was threatened. The crown's revenues from the duchy stopped. Something had to be done, and Edward, who could not bring himself to go to France in person, looked around for an alternative. The alternative was Isabella. She was a daughter of the late King of France, a sister of the current king. She was, despite her recent treatment by her husband, still a recognized Queen of England with the diplomatic standing the negotiations required. And the Despensers, who had been cool to the suggestion at first, came round to it when they realized what it would mean. Isabella out of England, away from the prince, unable to make trouble at home, and obliged to negotiate on terms her husband would set. She was proposed to her brother Charles as the English ambassador. Charles accepted. In early March 1325, Isabella took ship at Dover, crossed the Channel, and rode for Paris with a small English embassy at her back. She had not been to France for over a decade. She had not seen her brothers since they were boys. She had been Queen of England for 17 years. The Paris she returned to was the Paris of her childhood, and not the Paris of her childhood. The palace on the Isle was the same. The Sainte-Chapelle was the same. The Seine ran grey under the same windows. Her brother Charles, on the throne her father had held, looked something like her father had looked, and behaved with some of his coldness. But the world around them had changed. Her father was dead. Her two elder brothers were dead. Two of their wives had been put on trial for adultery in the Tower of Nesle scandal of 1314, and locked up afterwards in conditions that had eventually killed them. The Capetian dynasty, that had been the marvel of Christendom in her childhood, was visibly shrinking. The court was watchful, anxious, less brilliant than she remembered, and in this court, among the exiles and pensioners and political refugees who collected at the French court in any reign, was Roger Mortimer of Wigmore. The negotiations took weeks. Isabella worked hard. She was by every account an effective ambassador. She knew her brother, she knew the French court, she knew exactly what could and could not be settled. By May 1325, a draft treaty had been agreed under which Edward II would pay an indemnity, would do homage for Gascony in person in the autumn, and would be confirmed in the duchy at a reduced extent. Edward signed the draft in June. The plan was that he would cross to France in late summer to perform the homage. And then, in late summer, he changed his mind. He did not want to go. He was afraid. The Despensers were afraid for him. They knew that if the king went to France without them, his enemies in Paris could detach him from them. They knew also that if they went with him, they would not be safe on French soil. The solution proposed, and ultimately adopted, was that Prince Edward, now 12 years old, should be invested with the Duchy of Gascony in his own name, and should go to France to perform the homage in his father's place. This was a colossal blunder. The Despensers, who pushed the plan because it kept Edward II in England with them, did not see what they were doing. They were sending the heir to the throne into the custody of his mother, who hated them, in a country whose king was her brother. Isabella saw it. She did not draw attention to her seeing it. In September 1325, the boy was invested with the duchy at Westminster. In late September, he crossed to France with a small escort. By the first week of October, he was in Paris, where his mother was waiting for him. The homage was performed at Bois de Vincennes on the 24th of September. The transfer was complete, and now the heir to the English throne was on French soil, in the household of his mother, who had no immediate intention of sending him home. The autumn of 1325 in Paris was the autumn in which the affair began. The chronicles are united on the existence of the affair and reticent about the details, which is to their credit and the historian's frustration. By Christmas 1325, it was no secret at the French court that the Queen of England and the exiled Marcher Lord had become lovers. By the spring of 1326, when Isabella began to negotiate with the Count of Hainaut for the marriage of Prince Edward to one of his daughters, she did so as if Mortimer were her acknowledged partner in the enterprise. Edward II, in England, wrote her increasingly furious letters demanding her return. She did not return. She gave reasons. Her safety in England was uncertain while the Despensers ruled. Her dower was still being withheld. She had work to finish in France. The reasons were ostensibly diplomatic. They were also, by autumn 1326, ostensibly the cover for the assembly of an army. The months in Paris, through the winter of 1325 and the spring of 1326, were the most productive months of her political life to date. She was operating, for the first time, with a free hand. She was no longer at her husband's court, surrounded by her husband's officers. She was at her brother's court, where her position as a daughter of Philip the Fair carried weight that no amount of English hostility could counterbalance. Her brother was an indifferent administrator, but a man who, when his sister appeared in his court, fleeing what she described as an intolerable situation, did the family thing and gave her shelter. The English ambassadors sent to demand her return found that they could not gain audience with her at all, and could not extract any commitment from her brother to return her. The papal envoys sent at Edward's request to mediate did no better. The Pope himself, Clement V's successor John XVI at Avignon, wrote letters in carefully balanced terms recommending reconciliation, but he did not press the matter further. The French court was harbouring its prodigal princess. The English court should shout from the far side of the Channel. The shouting changed nothing. She used the months to gather around her the men she would need. Mortimer was the centrepiece, but he was not the only exile or political refugee at the French court. The English political class had been producing exiles steadily since the rise of the Despensers. Some had escaped from prison. Some had fled before they could be arrested. Some had simply gone abroad and stayed there because they could see what was coming. By 1325, there was a small English colony at the French court, supported by French pensions, waiting for the day when an opportunity would arise. Isabella met them. She received them at her own lodgings, separately from her brother's court. She listened to their grievances. She heard their accounts of what the Despensers had done in England, the lands they had seized, the families they had broken, the widows they had defrauded. She built, during the winter of 1325, a working political coalition out of these men. Some of them were soldiers' knights, who had served in the Welsh wars and the Scottish campaigns. Some were lawyers, some were clerics. Together they constituted the nucleus of the regime that would take over England the following year. The men who joined her in Paris included Henry de Beaumont, an old soldier whose lands in the north of England had been stripped because he had married a Scottish heiress and could be accused of disloyalty to the Bruce Wars. Edmund of Woodstock, Earl of Kent, who was the king's own half-brother and who had crossed to France ostensibly to assist his sister-in-law, but had then decided, after meeting Isabella, that he could not return to England as long as the Despensers ruled. John of Brittany, Earl of Richmond, who had been ambassador to France for years and who simply did not go home when his term ended. Thomas Wake, a young lord of the north of England, whose father had been Hereford's man. Several bishops in transit through Paris on church business who had become, after meeting her, willing to communicate her views to their colleagues in England. The diplomatic embassy that she had been sent to lead was, by the spring of 1326, no longer an embassy. It was a shadow court. It conducted its own correspondence. It received its own visitors. It maintained its own finances, paid partly from her diminished dower receipts that her officers in England were still managing to collect and to remit, and partly from gifts and pensions from her brother and uncles. The arrival of Prince Edward in Paris in September 1325 transformed the shadow court into something more substantial. The boy was the heir to the throne of England. He had been sent to do homage for Gascony in his father's place. He had performed that homage at Bois de Vincennes in late September. The English crown's expectation was that he would return home within weeks. He did not return. He stayed with his mother through the autumn and winter and spring. He met the exiles. He participated in the discussions. He listened with the watchful intelligence that his mother had been training into him for years to what the men around her were saying about his father's government. He drew his own conclusions in his 13-year-old way about what needed to happen. The chronicles do not record his early statements on this. But by the spring of 1326, when his mother began the negotiations with the Count of Hainaut for his marriage, he was a willing participant in the plans she was making, and his support, his physical presence, his royal status, his acceptance of the implicit succession argument made the rest of the planning possible. The Hainaut negotiations were the operational hinge of the whole enterprise. The Count of Hainaut, William the Good, was the ruler of a small but rich territory in the Low Countries, modern Belgium and the southern Netherlands, that produced sailors, soldiers, and good currency in unusual abundance for its size. He had 4 daughters. He was looking for husbands for them in suitable royal houses. He had the kind of disposable cash that the English crown, by 1326, did not. Isabella opened the negotiations through intermediaries in early 1326. She offered the marriage of her son to one of the daughters in exchange for a dowry payable as a military contribution, ships, men, and money for an invasion of England. The Count, after some hesitation, agreed. The marriage was settled. The daughter chosen was Philippa, the second, whom Prince Edward had picked when the visit was arranged. The military terms were drafted, the ships were promised, the men were promised, the money was promised. By summer, the agreement was complete, and the assembly of the force at Dordrecht could begin. Isabella's strategy across these months was a model of medieval political action. She had taken her time. She had used her brother's protection to give her work the cover it needed. She had built her coalition out of disparate exiles and gathered them around her son. She had identified the one foreign ally who could supply the military assets she lacked and had paid the price he demanded her son's marriage, without flinching. She had moved the prince into the center of the enterprise so that the invasion she was about to launch would be, in its own framing, not a rebellion against the king, but a restoration of good government around the heir. She had done all of this while ostensibly conducting routine diplomatic business at her brother's court. The English crown, watching from the far side of the channel, did not understand what was happening until it was nearly too late to respond. By the time Edward II began to issue orders for the defence of the coast against an expected invasion in the summer of 1326, the invasion was already organising itself at Dordrecht, and the political class of England had already, in substantial part, decided which way it would jump when the landing happened. Isabella had been preparing for 19 years. The execution would take 10 weeks. The agreement with the Count of Hainaut was reached in the spring of 1326. Philippa, his second daughter, would marry Prince Edward when both were of age. She was about 12, he was 13. In return, the Count of Hainaut would supply ships, men, and money for an invasion of England to overthrow the Despensers. The contract was carefully drawn. The men were assembled at Dordrecht through the summer of 1326. By September, Isabella, Mortimer, the Prince, and a force of about 1,500 Hainauters, English exiles and Flemish mercenaries were on board ship in the Dordrecht estuary. On the 22nd of September 1326, they sailed. On the 24th, they landed at Orwell in Suffolk. The thing that her family had been preparing her for since she was a child in Paris had finally arrived. She was 31 years old. She had been a queen for 18 years, and she was, for the first time in her life, in command. The landing at Orwell on the 24th of September 1326 was almost laughably easy. There was no resistance on the beach. There was no force in the field to oppose her. The English fleet that the Despensers had been preparing all summer had failed to put to sea, partly because its sailors had been refusing to embark, and partly because its captains had been refusing to take it out. The royal commissions for the defence of the realm had been issued, but they had not produced an army. The barons whom Edward had ordered to assemble at Orford had not assembled. The county levies of East Anglia, when called out, had melted away. When Isabella came ashore at Orwell with her son and Mortimer, and her small invading force, what she found waiting for her was not opposition, but a great silence, into which her arrival could be expanded at her own pace. The voyage from Dordrecht had taken 2 days. The fleet had consisted of about 95 small ships, most of them Hainaut hire vessels, with the troops crammed below decks and the horses in slings to prevent them from injuring themselves in the rough September seas. Mortimer commanded the military element. Isabella sailed in a larger ship at the centre of the flotilla, with her son and the principal officers of her household. The crossing had been routine. Bad weather had been feared, because September in the southern North Sea is not a kindly season, but the winds had been favourable. The fleet had sighted the Suffolk coast on the morning of the 24th and had identified the broad, shallow estuary of the Orwell as the safest landing ground. The men had come ashore through the surf in small boats. The horses had been swum or led ashore as the tide permitted. The whole landing had taken most of the day and into the evening, and by nightfall the army was in a fortified camp on the dunes above the beach, with sentries posted and the local population thoroughly puzzled by what had happened. The local population, in fact, was the first practical test of the invasion. The barons of East Anglia were notable absentees from the king's recent musters. The county sheriff of Suffolk made no move to oppose the landing. The local towns and villages, when approached by Isabella's foragers in the days after the landing, supplied food and forage on payment, in some cases without payment. The first English magnate to ride into her camp was Thomas of Brotherton, Earl of Norfolk, who held his earldom from his half-brother the king, and had been expected to be a loyalist. He arrived on the 25th of September with his retainers. He kneeled to her. He pledged his service. The Earl was the senior English magnate within reach of the landing site, and his immediate adherence set the tone for everything that followed. Within 48 hours, the network of East Anglian knighthood and burgher class had begun to coalesce around her camp, supplying soldiers, horses, intelligence, and political support. The invasion was being absorbed into the country at a pace that the regime in London had no means to interrupt. She moved her army inland to Bury St Edmunds, where she rested for 3 days at the abbey. She was joined there by Henry of Lancaster, the brother of the executed Thomas, who had crossed from his estates with a substantial retinue. Within a fortnight she had been joined by most of the bishops of the realm, by the Earls of Norfolk and Kent, both half-brothers of Edward II, and by the City of London, which sent a formal declaration of loyalty. She issued, from Bury, a careful proclamation that set the tone of the whole campaign. She was not, she declared, making war on her husband the king. She was making war on the evil counsellors who had taken him captive and were ruining the realm. Her quarrel was with the dispensers. She was acting to restore good government, to free the king from his oppressors, and to put the realm under the rule of its rightful counsellors. The proclamation was a careful piece of political language. It allowed every English magnate who wanted to join her to do so, without admitting that they were in rebellion against their king. It allowed the bishops to support her without violating their oaths. It allowed the City of London to declare for her under the cover of restoring the realm. It was, in short, a beautifully calibrated document of insurrection, and the model on which every subsequent English political coup of the next 3 centuries would more or less be conducted. Edward II, in London, did not understand what was happening to him. He had spent the summer in a kind of frantic confidence, expecting that the fleet would prevent any invasion, that the levies would meet any force that landed, that the affair would be over in a matter of weeks. By the first week of October, it was clear that none of this was happening. He sent messages to bishops and barons demanding their loyalty. The messages were ignored. He issued proclamations of his own. The proclamations were ignored. He sat in the Tower of London with Hugh Despenser the younger and tried to compose a strategy. There was none. The country had decided it was done with him. On the 2nd of October 1326, the king fled London. He took with him the 2 dispensers, a small bodyguard, and the Great Seal. He left behind his younger son, John of Eltham, who at 10 years old was nominally placed in command of the city's defence. He rode west, hoping to raise the western counties and Wales. He reached Bristol by the middle of October. He left Hugh Despenser the elder there with the garrison of Bristol Castle. He continued west into Wales with Hugh the younger, intending to reach the Despenser strongholds in Glamorgan and there to hold out until a relieving force could be assembled. There was no relieving force. There was no faction left in England willing to support him. Bristol fell on the 26th of October. The garrison opened the gates without much resistance, the townsmen having declared for Isabella as soon as her army appeared. Hugh Despenser the elder, then in his mid-60s, was taken prisoner. He was tried at Bristol the following day. The charges were the usual ones for a man whose downfall was being arranged by his enemies: treason, breach of the ordinances, malfeasance in office, theft of crown lands. He was sentenced to death. He was hanged at Bristol on the 27th of October, in his armour, on the orders of his lawful sovereign's wife. The execution was carried out factually and without delay. The crowd that watched it was reported by the chroniclers to have been substantial and not, on the whole, unhappy. The pursuit of the king and Hugh the younger continued through November. They crossed into South Wales, where the Despenser estates were thickest, and tried to raise the Welsh tenantry. The tenantry did not rise. They took ship at Chepstow, hoping to reach Lundy Island or Ireland. The winds drove them back. They landed near Cardiff, struck inland for Caerphilly Castle, the great Despenser fortress, and got within a few miles of it before their position became untenable. They were tracked across the Welsh hills by a force under Henry of Lancaster's direct command. On the 16th of November 1326, in a small wood near Lantrisant, the king and his favourite were taken. There was no fight. The bodyguard that remained with them surrendered. Henry of Lancaster, who had taken his prisoners with the deliberate satisfaction of a man avenging his brother, conveyed Edward to Kenilworth Castle and Hugh Despenser, the younger, to Hereford for trial. Hereford. The 24th of November, 1326. Hugh Despenser the younger was tried before a tribunal that included Isabella, Mortimer, Henry of Lancaster, and the principal English magnates who had assembled to receive the king. He was given no opportunity to speak in his own defence, though by some accounts he attempted a hunger strike in the days before the trial, which is the only resistance he had left. He was convicted of treason, of theft, of murder, of breach of the ordinances, and of a series of offences against the Queen specifically that were not normally chargeable as treason, but were now treated as such. He was sentenced to death. The execution that followed was conducted under the form of the punishment for the highest treasons of the age, and need not be described in physical detail. It was carried out at Hereford on the same day as the trial. It was by every chronicler's account brutal, and it was watched by a substantial crowd. Hugh Despenser the younger, who had been the second most powerful man in England for nearly 5 years, ceased to exist within an afternoon. The end of the regime he had built was the end of him. Isabella, who attended the trial and witnessed the execution, recorded no public reaction. She had been working towards this for 3 years, since the day in September 1324, when her dower had been stripped at the Despenser's direction and her household broken up. She did not need to celebrate. She was a queen of the medieval royal house, raised by Philip the Fair and Joan of Navarre, and she did not display emotion in front of crowds. She watched what was done in her name. She withdrew to her lodging when the work was finished. She wrote that evening the dispatches that needed to be written. The Despenser regime was over. Her husband was at Kenilworth Castle under Henry of Lancaster's custody. Her son was with her at Hereford. The realm of England was for the moment entirely in her hands. She was 31 years old. The question now was what to do next. The court moved from Hereford to Wallingford for Christmas. Wallingford was Isabella's own dower castle, a comfortable house on the Thames in Berkshire, and she kept the festival there with her son and Mortimer and the assembled magnates of her victorious party. The Christmas of 1326 must have been one of the strangest in the medieval English calendar. A queen who had invaded her own kingdom kept Christmas in her own castle, while the king, who was nominally her husband, sat in another castle in the Midlands under guard. There were no precedents, there was no procedure. The bishops who had supported her, the barons who had joined her, the City of London, which had backed her, none of them had a settled idea of what should happen next. There were only 2 clear facts. The Despensers were dead. The king could not return to power on any terms that anyone present at Wallingford that Christmas was willing to accept. The next step, however, had not yet been articulated. It would be articulated at the Parliament called for January 1327, and what was articulated there was a thing no one in the medieval English political class had done before. The Parliament that assembled at Westminster in January 1327 was the most extraordinary Parliament in English history to that date. It had been summoned in the King's name, but the King was not present. He had been invited formally by Isabella and the council that was now governing in his absence to attend, and he had refused, sending word from Kenilworth that he would not come to a Parliament called by traitors. His refusal was politically convenient for Isabella's party. It allowed them to proceed without him. It allowed them to argue, with some plausibility, that he had voluntarily withdrawn himself from the government of the realm, and it gave them the legal opening they needed for what they intended to do. What they intended to do had not been done before. No English king since the conquest had been formally deposed by his own subjects. There were precedents elsewhere in Europe. Of course, popes had been deposed, emperors had been deposed. The kings of Castile and Aragon had occasionally been replaced by their families. But no English king had ever been removed by parliamentary process while still alive and in possession of his faculties. The legal forms did not exist. The procedures had not been written. The question of who exactly had the authority to depose a king of England was, in the standard learned opinions of the day, not a question that admitted of a clear answer. What Isabella and her advisers had to do, in the weeks before the Parliament met and during the Parliament itself, was invent the procedure as they went along, and dress the invention in enough constitutional form that the country would accept the result. The work was led by Adam Orleton, Bishop of Hereford, who was one of the most learned canon lawyers in England and a long-time enemy of the dispensers. Orleton was assisted by Walter Reynolds, Archbishop of Canterbury, a man who had been Edward II's tutor and friend, but who had, like so many others, gone over to Isabella in the autumn of 1326. The legal theory they constructed was elaborate and substantially novel. The king, they argued, had broken his coronation oath. He had failed to govern according to the law. He had taken evil counsel. He had been guilty of cruelty and incompetence to a degree that violated his obligations to his subjects. The subjects, in turn, were absolved of their obligations to him. The kingdom, by this reasoning, was vacant of a king, and the Parliament speaking for the kingdom could supply the lack by recognising the rightful heir. The rightful heir was Prince Edward, now 14. He had been brought to London for the Parliament. He sat by his mother through the sessions. He was a thoughtful, observant boy who had been receiving an unusually direct education in statecraft for the past 3 years, and who understood, as well as anyone present, what was being done. He was, in the formal sense, the alternative to his father, whom the Parliament was about to recognise. The question of what he himself thought about this is the question every historian asks and no historian can fully answer. He never publicly disowned his mother for what she did. He never publicly endorsed it either in his later life as king. He was 14 years old in January 1327, and his father was being deposed in his name. He behaved with the composure that he had probably learned from his mother, and that would later be one of the marks of his 50-year reign. The procedure adopted was, in the end, a hybrid. There was a parliamentary debate. There was an articles of accusation read against the king, listing his failings in detail. There was a vote by the lords spiritual and temporal, by the knights of the shire, by the burgesses of the cities, an early form of estate representation designed to give the deposition the broadest possible base. There was a formal delegation sent to Kenilworth to convey the result to the king in person. The delegation, which included Orleton and a number of senior lords, reached Kenilworth in mid-January. They informed the king that his subjects had withdrawn their homage from him and recognised his son as king. They informed him that he was invited to abdicate in favour of his son, and that if he refused, his son would be crowned anyway, and Edward would be left without status, without estate, and without name. Edward, in his chamber at Kenilworth, broke down. He had not believed that this could happen. He wept. He cursed his enemies. He pleaded with the delegation. Eventually, in the manner of a man who had run out of resistance, he agreed to abdicate. The abdication was performed on the 20th of January 1327 in the great chamber of Kenilworth Castle, in the presence of the delegation and his own remaining household. Sir William Trussell, on behalf of the assembled Parliament and people of England, formally renounced their homage. The act was witnessed and recorded. Edward of Caernarfon, until that morning Edward II of England, was returned to private status. He retained the name Edward of Caernarfon. He retained his honour. He retained his life. He retained nothing else. His son Edward III was proclaimed king the following day. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 1st of February 1327, exactly 19 years after his father had been crowned in the same place by the same office on the same day of the year. He was 14. The coronation was magnificent. The boy carried himself with dignity. The Archbishop placed the crown on his head, the same crown that Piers Gaveston had carried into the Abbey 19 years before. The procession passed out of the Abbey to the great feast at Westminster Hall. Isabella sat at the boy king's right hand. The country had a new monarch. Because the king was a minor, a regency was required. The arrangement that was put in place was complex, in part because of the unwillingness of the principal players to be seen to be openly assuming power. A standing council was nominated. Henry of Lancaster, the brother of the executed Thomas, was made the official guardian of the young king. Real power, however, was elsewhere. Isabella, who had ridden the invasion that had brought the new king to the throne, was now the most powerful person in the realm, and Roger Mortimer, who stood beside her, was the principal partner in that power. Neither of them held a formal office. Mortimer was not regent. Isabella was not officially regent. But every decision of substance, every grant of land, every appointment to office, passed through her hands and his, and the standing council that was nominally governing was, in practice, taking its instructions from them. The grants that were made to Isabella in the months following the coronation were on a scale unprecedented in the history of English queenship. Her dower, which had been stripped from her in 1324, was returned. Beyond the dower, she was granted estates that had belonged to the executed dispensers, to the imprisoned Mortimer's wife, to the Earl of Arundel, who had been executed at Hereford, and to a long list of other sources. The total annual income from her estates, by the calculations of modern historians, came to roughly £20,000 a year, a sum exceeded in England only by the Crown itself. She was, as a private subject, the wealthiest person in the kingdom after her son, the king. The grants were not, in themselves, illegal. They had been formally authorised by the king and council, but the scale of them was conspicuous. The pattern of them, the accumulation of estates in the Queen Mother's hands at the expense of every other interest, was visible to anyone who looked. The seeds of the resentment that would eventually destroy her regime were being planted in the very settlement that secured it. Edward of Caernarfon remained at Kenilworth in the months immediately following his abdication. The arrangement was that he should be kept in a kind of honourable retirement with a household appropriate to his former rank, sufficient income to maintain himself, freedom to receive visitors approved by the council, and freedom from any form of public humiliation. Henry of Lancaster, who had custody of him, was a courteous and decent jailer. He treated his cousin with the respect due to a former monarch. He provided him with comfortable rooms, good food, a chaplain, books, and a small staff to attend him. By all accounts, Edward at Kenilworth in the spring of 1327 was as comfortable as a deposed king could reasonably hope to be. This arrangement did not survive the summer. In late March 1327, a confused conspiracy of his remaining supporters, Dominican friars, minor knights, a few priests, the kind of plotters that any deposed monarch attracts, attempted to liberate him from Kenilworth. The plot was discovered before it could be put into action. It collapsed without difficulty, but it alarmed Isabella's council. If Lancaster was not a sufficient jailer to prevent escape attempts, a different jailer would have to be found. The decision was made in April 1327 to move Edward to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, the seat of Thomas, Lord Berkeley, who was Mortimer's son-in-law and could be relied upon to provide security of the kind the new regime required. The move was carried out in early April. From Kenilworth to Berkeley is about 90 miles. The journey was made under guard, in a closed cart, with sufficient escort to prevent any rescue attempt. Edward arrived at Berkeley in early April 1327 and remained there for the rest of his recorded life. Berkeley Castle is an old Norman fortress on the Severn estuary, in the flat marshy country south of Gloucester. It is small by the standards of the great royal castles, dominated by a single squat keep with a curtain wall around an inner ward. The dungeons are in the keep. The rooms in which a noble prisoner would be lodged are in the upper floors of the keep, with narrow windows looking out over the marshes towards the river. The estuary in spring is grey and broad, with the wind off the Severn carrying the smell of mud and salt marsh, and gulls inland in flocks from the river mouth. Edward of Caernarfon was kept in one of the upper chambers of the keep. His conditions, by the standards of medieval royal imprisonment, were not severe in the formal sense. He was not in chains. He was not in a dungeon. He had a chaplain. He had a bed. He had at least the appearance of dignity. But he was a prisoner. The door was locked. The windows were narrow. He saw, in the mornings, the mist coming in off the marshes. He saw, in the evenings, the long western light over the estuary. He saw between the inside of a chamber not much larger than the one his father had given him at Caernarfon at his birth. His circumstances at Berkeley deteriorated through the spring and summer of 1327. A second plot to release him was uncovered in July, involving a Welsh nobleman called Rhys ap Gruffydd. A third was rumoured in August. Each attempt made the regime in London more anxious. Each anxiety produced a tightening of his conditions. Letters survive from Lord Berkeley to the council complaining about the cost of feeding the deposed king and his household. Other letters describe a regime in which his food was reduced, his chamber smaller, his outdoor exercise removed. The most striking surviving document is a poem in French that has been attributed to Edward himself, written in the form of a complaint by a man unjustly deprived of his crown and longing for the love of his wife. The poem may or may not be authentic. The image of Edward at Berkeley in the summer of 1327, in any case, is of a man in a slow constriction of circumstances, watched closely by men who had no warmth for him, surrounded by reminders of what he had lost. On the 21st of September 1327, Lord Berkeley wrote to the King's Council to inform them that Edward of Caernarfon had died at Berkeley Castle on the night of the 21st. The cause of death was not specified in detail. The body, Berkeley's letter said, was being prepared for transport and burial. The letter reached the council at Lincoln, where it was governing, on the 23rd of September. The council acknowledged the news and issued instructions for the funeral. The body was conveyed from Berkeley to Gloucester Abbey, where it was prepared for burial and lay in state through the autumn, while arrangements were made for the funeral procession. The funeral itself was held at Gloucester Abbey on the 20th of December 1327, in front of Isabella, Mortimer, the young king, and most of the senior nobility and clergy of England. The body was buried in the Abbey church under a fine tomb that Isabella herself paid for, and that survives today as one of the great pieces of 14th century English funerary sculpture. Gloucester Abbey, which had been a comfortable, rich monastery before that day, became within a generation a pilgrimage site as the cult of the murdered king grew up around the tomb of the man whose deposition the chroniclers were already, by the 1330s, treating as a great sin. What killed Edward of Caernarfon at Berkeley Castle on the 21st of September 1327 is a question that historians have argued about ever since. Two broad accounts have come down to us. The first, from the chronicles closest in time to the event, was that he died of natural causes: grief, despair, perhaps an illness brought on by the conditions of his captivity. The second, which developed in the chronicles of the 1330s and 1340s and reached its full elaboration much later, was that he was murdered on the orders of his wife and Mortimer by methods that the later chroniclers described in physical detail of a kind that this script will not reproduce. Modern historians have moved back and forth between these accounts. Some have proposed a third possibility, that Edward did not die at Berkeley at all, but was secretly removed elsewhere and lived in obscurity for years. Each generation of scholarship has produced new arguments. The most that can be said with confidence is that the cause of death is unknown, that the regime that announced the death had every motive to remove the deposed king and was capable of arranging his removal, and that the chronicles closest in time were vague about the circumstances, in a way that suggests their authors did not know either. Isabella's own role, if any, has never been proven. She was at the council at Lincoln when the letter from Berkeley arrived. She did not visit the castle in the weeks before the death. She paid for an expensive tomb. None of this excludes complicity. None of it requires it. The matter is, and will probably always remain, beyond what the surviving evidence can resolve. What is certain is that the death of Edward of Caernarfon, however it happened, removed a problem from his wife's regime that would have continued to grow as long as he was alive. As long as he lived, he was a focus for conspiracy. As long as he lived, he could, in principle, be restored. With his death natural, induced or staged, the focus disappeared. The regime could consolidate. Isabella, who had borne her husband 4 children and outlasted him by nearly 31 years, was now a widow at 32. She wore the formal mourning, the position required. She attended the funeral at Gloucester. She paid for the tomb. She made the appropriate offerings for his soul. And she returned to the work of governing the realm with her lover, who was no longer technically her lover by the strict definition of the canon law, because she was no longer a married woman. The day after the funeral at Gloucester, the court moved on. The realm of England had 3 months of crisis in 1326, and 3 months of constitutional reconstruction in 1327. And now it had a regime that needed to settle into the work of actually ruling. Isabella was 32. Mortimer was 40. The king was 15. The country was at peace. The Despensers were dead. The executed Lancaster was avenged. The dynasty was secure. The next 3 years would be the years in which Isabella's regime, given a clear field at last, governed England in her son's name. They would also be the years in which the regime overreached, and in which the son began, very slowly, to plan his own move against his mother. The years 1327 to 1330 were the years in which Isabella and Mortimer governed England in the name of her son. They were not, by the standards of medieval English government, bad years. The realm was at peace internally. The Despenser depredations had been reversed. The ordinances of 1311, which Edward II had repealed in 1322, were not restored as a package, but their principal protections of baronial interest were honoured in practice. The administrative business of the kingdom went forward. The exchequer functioned. The chancery functioned. The royal courts heard cases and gave judgment. The country was, by the bare measure of whether it was being well or ill ruled, being ruled adequately. The trouble was not in the government. The trouble was in the manner of it. Isabella and Mortimer governed without holding any formal office that gave them authority. They sat on the king's council. They directed its business. They controlled the king's seal. They drafted the writs in his name. But they were not, by any law of England, entitled to govern. The young king was the king. He was a minor, but the medieval English convention was that a king's minority should be governed by a council of magnates appointed by Parliament, not by his mother and her partner. The convention had been observed in 1327 with the nominal appointment of a standing council and the formal guardianship of Henry of Lancaster. By 1328, the convention was being openly disregarded. Isabella and Mortimer made the decisions. The standing council assented. Henry of Lancaster, who had begun by accepting the arrangement, found his role being steadily diminished and his counsel disregarded. By the spring of 1328, he was in open opposition to the regime he had helped create. He had, as the chroniclers noted with some pleasure, become the first of many. The most damaging single act of the regime was the Treaty of Northampton, concluded in May 1328. The treaty ended the long Scottish War that Edward II had so disastrously continued through his reign. It recognised Robert Bruce as king of an independent Scotland. It returned to Scotland the regalia and royal records that English kings had carried south since the wars of Edward I. It included a marriage alliance between Bruce's son David and Edward III's 7-year-old sister Joan of the Tower. The Scots gave up their support for English exiles and paid an indemnity of £20,000. The treaty was, by the standards of cold realism, a reasonable settlement of a war that England had been losing for 15 years. By the standards of English national feeling, it was a humiliation. The English political class did not want a recognition of Scottish independence. They did not want to surrender the regalia. They did not want, above all, the marriage of an English princess to a Scottish prince. The treaty became known almost at once as the Shameful Peace, and the term stuck. Isabella and Mortimer had purchased a real peace at the cost of every constituency in England that cared about Scotland, which was substantial. The marriage of David Bruce and Joan of the Tower was performed at Berwick on the 17th of July 1328. Joan was 7 years old. David was 4. Isabella attended. She rode north with her younger daughter, attended the wedding in the great hall of Berwick Castle, handed the child over to her Scottish in-laws, and rode south again. The image of the Queen Mother delivering her 7-year-old daughter to be raised at the Scottish court that her father had spent his reign attempting to subdue is one of the harder images of her life to soften. But the marriage was the diplomatic centerpiece of the treaty, and the treaty was the centerpiece of the regime's foreign policy, and Joan was the available daughter. Isabella, who had been promised at 7 and married at 13, was not unsympathetic to her daughter's situation, but she sent her north anyway. The peace required it. In the meantime, the marriage of her son had been arranged. Philippa of Hainault, who had been promised to Edward at the contract of 1326, was now 16, and Edward was 16, and the marriage was concluded at York Minster on the 24th of January 1328. The wedding was attended by Isabella, by Mortimer, by the great magnates of England, and by an unusually large embassy from Hainault, led by Philippa's uncle, the Bishop of Liege. Philippa was a tall, plain, good-natured young woman who had been raised at the Hainault court to expect to be Queen of England, and who had been trained accordingly. Her dowry was modest, her dynastic value was small. What mattered was the alliance, and what mattered to Edward was that he liked her. They had met 2 years before at her father's court, when Isabella had been there negotiating the invasion. The young Edward had picked her from the Count's daughters with the boyish certainty of a 14-year-old who was being told he could choose. The choice had turned out to be sound. They would be married for 41 years and produce 12 children, and the marriage would become one of the great royal partnerships of medieval Europe. The wedding at York in January 1328 was the moment Isabella began, in retrospect, to lose her son. He was 16. He was now married to a young woman of his own age, with her own household, her own intelligence, her own opinions. The bond between mother and son that had defined the first 15 years of his life began, slowly, to be complicated by the bond between husband and wife. Philippa, who had been raised at a court not unlike the one Isabella had known in Paris, understood politics in the way that an educated medieval princess understood politics, and she became, over the following 2 years, the first person to whom Edward could speak about his mother's regime as one adult to another. The conversations that he had with his wife in their chamber at York and Windsor and Eltham and Woodstock over the years 1328 to 1330 are not on the record. But the conclusions he reached from them are the government Isabella conducted over these years had a shape that the chronicles have not always done justice to. It is easy, looking back from the catastrophe of October 1330, to treat the whole period as a continuous slide into the abuses for which Mortimer was later executed. The reality was more complicated. For the first 18 months after the coronation, the regime governed the country reasonably well by the standards of any medieval English government. The royal courts were open and giving judgment. The exchequer was functioning. The shires were administered by sheriffs who reported regularly. The wool customs were being collected. The diplomatic establishment was active across Europe, embassies to France for the resolution of the Gascon question, embassies to Aragon to confirm an old alliance, embassies to the papacy at Avignon for routine business, embassies to the German princes for the management of the imperial succession. The work of routine government continued through these years in a manner that any English king of the period would have recognised, and the people doing the work, the clerks of chancery, the barons of exchequer, the justices of the King's Bench and Common Pleas, the sheriffs of the counties, were broadly the same people who had been doing the same work under Edward II. The change of regime in 1327 had not been a change of the administrative class. It had been a change at the top of the political class, which is to say, at the level of the men who had access to the council and who set the policy that the administrators then carried out. At that level, the council, the policy, the access, Isabella and Mortimer were the substance of the regime, and the manner in which they operated had its own rhythm. The council met regularly, on a fixed cycle, in whatever house the court happened to be at. Henry of Lancaster sat at the head of it in his nominal capacity as guardian of the king. The other senior magnates sat at it when they were present. The senior officers of state, the chancellor, the treasurer, the keeper of the privy seal, attended ex officio. The young king attended when his mother required his presence, which became more frequent as he grew older and more competent. Isabella did not always attend in person. She was sometimes represented by a senior officer of her household who spoke on her behalf. Mortimer attended more often in the formal capacity of a senior member of the council. The decisions that were taken in council were drafted as writs and sent out under the king's seal. The decisions that were taken outside council, in the private chamber where Isabella and Mortimer worked together, were drafted as instructions to the council and presented to it as the king's pleasure. The fiction was that the king ruled. The reality was that his mother and her partner ruled in his name. Everyone in the country who mattered understood the distinction. Most of them, in 1327 and 1328, were willing to accept it as a temporary arrangement that the king's minority required. Isabella herself was, in the working sense, the senior member of the regime. The grants of land that were made in these years were made under her direction. The appointments to office were her decisions, communicated through Mortimer or directly to the Chancellor. The diplomatic dispatches went out in her name as often as in the king's. The household ordinances that managed the affairs of the court were issued by her authority. The marriages of the king's siblings, Eleanor of Woodstock to Reginald of Guelders in 1332, Joan of the Tower to David Bruce in 1328, were negotiated under her direction. The funeral arrangements for her husband at Gloucester in December 1327 were managed by her household. The construction of the tomb that survives there to this day was paid for from her chamber. She was the Queen Mother of England, and she was acting as Queen Mother in the strong sense the medieval position permitted, with substantive responsibilities for the diplomatic, religious, and ceremonial functions of the crown. Mortimer's role was subordinate, in this formal sense, to hers. His authority derived from his closeness to her, not from any office he held. He was a counsellor, like several others. He held no chief office of state. He was not steward. He was not chamberlain of the household. He was not treasurer. He was the Queen Mother's particular ally, and as the Queen Mother's particular ally, he had access to the king and the council and the patronage that flowed from them. The trouble was that this informal authority, combined with his temperament, produced behaviour that the English political class found intolerable in a manner that the Queen's behaviour did not. Isabella was a daughter and sister and mother of kings. Her position at the centre of the regime was, by the standards of the age, irregular but explicable. Mortimer was a marcher lord whose presence at the centre of the regime had no constitutional justification at all, and whose habit of behaving as if he were the king's stepfather was producing the kind of resentment that political alliances cannot survive. By the summer of 1328, the resentment was visible. By the autumn, it was articulate, and in October 1328, it found its issue. Mortimer, meanwhile, was making himself impossible. The man who had escaped from the Tower of London in 1323 had, by 1328, decided that he should be a magnate of England. He had taken back his old lands in the Welsh marches and added substantially to them. He had his wife restored to him from royal custody in a public reconciliation that was conventional and meaningless. He had married off several of his daughters to the heirs of senior baronial houses, building a network of in-laws through the English political class. In October 1328, he had himself created Earl of March, a wholly new earldom designed to give him a rank commensurate with his power. The creation was politically catastrophic. There had been no creation of a new earldom in England for nearly a century. The existing earls regarded their rank as fixed by ancient custom, and they regarded the elevation of Mortimer to a parity with themselves as an insult. Henry of Lancaster, in particular, who as senior earl had assumed a kind of presidency among them, found Mortimer's elevation intolerable. Within months he was raising his retainers in open opposition. The crisis was contained, with some difficulty, at the Parliament of Salisbury in October 1328, but the underlying anger did not subside. The regime's response to the discontent was not conciliation, but tightening. Through 1329, Mortimer surrounded himself with a personal bodyguard of about 180 Welsh and Irish soldiers, a small private army that he kept with him at court. He arranged for his daughters' marriages to be paid for from royal revenues. He took rooms at the principal royal castles for his own household. He travelled with a retinue that rivaled the king's. He behaved, in short, as if he were the king's stepfather, which under the canon law he was not, and as if he were the king's regent, which by the laws of England he was not. Isabella, who had begun the regime in 1327 as the senior partner, was increasingly being overshadowed by her lover. She remained the formal centre of the regime. She continued to be addressed in the diplomatic correspondence as the senior figure. But the day-to-day decisions were now substantially Mortimer's, and the policies that the regime was identified with were policies he had pushed through. In March 1330, the regime committed what would prove to be the act that destroyed it. Edmund of Woodstock, Earl of Kent, was the half-brother of Edward II and the uncle of Edward III. He had supported Isabella's invasion in 1326 and had benefited handsomely from the redistribution of estates that followed. By 1329, however, he had become convinced, possibly through a deliberate Mortimer trap, possibly through his own credulity, that his half-brother Edward II was still alive and being kept in secret confinement at Corfe Castle in Dorset. He began to make contacts with men he thought sympathetic. He wrote letters. He gathered support. In one of the letters, which was intercepted, he committed himself to a plan for the release of his supposedly living half-brother and the restoration of the old regime. The letter was passed to Mortimer. The Earl was arrested. He was tried before Parliament at Winchester in March 1330, found guilty of treason, and sentenced to death. He was executed on the 19th of March 1330. The execution was so unpopular that the headsman refused to perform it, and the sentence was eventually carried out by a condemned criminal who had been promised a pardon for the service. The Earl of Kent had been the most popular member of the royal family after the young king himself, and his death by Mortimer's contrivance produced a horror in the country that no previous act of the regime had produced. The young king, who was now 17, found that he could not protect his own uncle from his mother's lover. He understood, in the days following the execution, that the time for his mother's regime was running out. The summer of 1330 was the summer in which the young king began to plan. Edward III at 17 was a tall, fair, intelligent young man. Courteous in manner, careful in speech, watchful in a way that those around him often did not notice. He had been raised by his mother to be self-possessed under pressure, and he was. He had been raised by Mortimer, who took an active interest in his education, to be a warrior, and he had developed real skill in arms and a real love of campaign. He had been married for 2 years now, and had become very close to his wife. Philippa, who was pregnant for the first time, was due to be delivered in June. The birth was set for Woodstock, which had been her mother-in-law's house in earlier years, and which she now considered her own. On the 15th of June 1330, in the chamber at Woodstock, Philippa gave birth to a son. He was named Edward, after his father and grandfather, and he is known to history by the title he later acquired, and that overtook his given name, the Black Prince. The birth of the heir was an event of great significance to the young king. It made him, at 17, a father. It also made him, for the first time, conscious of a responsibility that ran past his own life into his son's. The succession of the dynasty depended on his being king, in fact, as well as in name. As long as his mother and Mortimer governed in his name, that was not the case. Through the late summer and early autumn of 1330, the young king assembled, with extreme caution, the men he could trust. William Montague, a friend of his own age who had been in his household for several years. Edward Bohun, son of the Earl of Hereford, a handful of others, none of them senior, none of them prominent, none of them likely to attract Mortimer's suspicion. The plan that was developed, by Montague in particular, was a coup. It would happen at the next great Parliament, which was scheduled for Nottingham in October. The court would be at Nottingham Castle. Mortimer and Isabella would be lodged in the upper apartments. The young king would join his confederates in seizing them in their own chamber by surprise by night. The plan was high risk. If it failed, Edward would lose his crown and probably his life. But if it succeeded, the country would be his. He was 17 years old and he had decided to make the attempt. The Parliament at Nottingham assembled in the second week of October 1330. The court arrived in stages. Mortimer had ridden ahead with his personal retinue, in his usual style, with his Welsh bodyguard around him and the trappings of a man who expected to be obeyed. Isabella had followed with her household in the more formal procession that her rank required. The young king and queen had come up from Woodstock with the infant Black Prince, who was now 4 months old. The senior magnates and bishops had been summoned to attend the Parliament, which was scheduled to consider, among other matters, the long-running question of how the regime should be financed in the year ahead. Nottingham Castle in October 1330 was an old Norman fortress built on the great sandstone rock that gives the town its character, a high outcrop above the river that had been fortified since the conquest, and that had been one of the principal royal castles of the Midlands ever since. The keep stood on the highest part of the rock, with the inner ward below it and the outer bailey beyond. The royal apartments were in the upper rooms of the keep. The young king and his wife had been allotted rooms in the inner ward, somewhat below his mother's, an arrangement that Mortimer had personally directed and that the king had accepted without complaint. He had been accepting many such arrangements through the spring and summer. He had been waiting. Mortimer had become, by October 1330, a man who was both arrogant and frightened. The arrogance was old. The fear was new. He had begun to suspect that the young king was no longer a manageable boy. He had noticed that Edward was spending more time with his own friends than with Mortimer's officers. He had noticed that the Queen Philippa was increasingly forming her own council. He had noticed that the senior magnates, several of whom he had reason to distrust, were speaking together in corridors at court in a way that he could not overhear. He had increased his personal bodyguard. He had given orders that the king should not leave the castle unaccompanied. He had insisted that all entries to the upper apartments, where he and Isabella lodged, should be locked at night, and the keys held by his own constable. The constable was William Eland, an old soldier who had served Mortimer for years and could be trusted entirely. The arrangements were, by the standards of medieval security, professional. What Mortimer did not know was that William Eland, while loyal in his way, was also a Nottingham man who had grown up on the rock. He knew the castle better than its newer custodians did. He knew in particular about an old underground passage that ran from the riverside meadow at the foot of the rock, up through the body of the sandstone, into the very heart of the inner ward of the castle. The passage was a relic of an older fortification. It had not been used in living memory. It was not on any plan. It was not part of the security perimeter. It had been forgotten. William Eland had not forgotten it. And on the night of the 17th of October 1330, Eland was in conversation with William Montague, the young king's closest friend, and he was telling him about the passage. The conversation was the beginning of the plot's execution. Montague, who had been working on the operation for months, brought his small group of conspirators into Nottingham over the next 2 days. They were lodged at an inn in the town below the rock. They consisted of about 20 men in arms. Their plan was simple. On the appointed night, William Eland would meet them at the riverside entrance to the passage. He would lead them up through the sandstone. The young king, who would have made an excuse to slip away from the royal apartments and meet them in the inner ward, would join them. They would proceed together through the corridors of the keep to the chamber where Mortimer and Isabella slept. They would force the door. They would seize Mortimer. They would convey him out through the same passage to a horse waiting in the meadow. They would ride hard for London. The appointed night was the 19th of October. The moon was old and the rock was dark. The conspirators assembled at the riverside entrance at about 10 o'clock. Eland was there with a lantern and the door to the passage was open. They entered. The passage was low and narrow, cut through the rock, with the air close and the steps worn smooth by centuries of feet that had been forgotten. They climbed. The lantern threw small lights on the stone. After perhaps a quarter of an hour, they emerged into a vaulted chamber that opened into the inner ward of the castle. The young king was waiting for them. He had told his attendants he was retiring to pray. He was dressed in mail, under a plain surcoat. He took command of the party. They moved together through the corridors of the inner ward and up the staircase that led to the upper apartments. At the top of the staircase was the antechamber to the royal apartments. There were 2 men of Mortimer's bodyguard on duty. They challenged the party. The king's men killed them. One chronicler says quickly and without resistance. Another says after a brief struggle. The party moved on. They reached the door of the chamber in which Mortimer and Isabella were lodged. The door was locked. They broke it down. The chamber within was lit by the small fire in the hearth and a single candle on a table. Mortimer was at the table, in his shirt, in conference with 2 of his officers. He reached for his sword. The conspirators were upon him before he could draw it. He was seized. The 2 officers fought briefly and were killed. The chamber filled with confused noise, the shouting of the conspirators, the cries of the women in the inner chamber, the breaking of furniture, the sound of armed men in a small space. Isabella appeared at the door of the inner chamber. She had been getting ready for bed. She was in her nightgown with a robe thrown over it. Her hair was down. She saw her son. She saw Mortimer in the grip of the king's men. She understood, with the speed that had always been her great quality, what was happening. The chronicle records what she said next. It survives in the original French, the same language her own household had used through her whole life. Belle fits ayez pitié du gentil Mortimer. Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer. The phrase has come down through 7 centuries and is one of the most famous things any English queen ever said. It was the wrong appeal. It was an appeal to a son who was already through with his mother's regime, and it acknowledged, in its very form, who Mortimer was to her and what her relation to him had been. The young king did not answer her. He gave orders for Mortimer to be conveyed out of the chamber, out of the castle, out of the city. He did not look at his mother. He did not address her. He turned and left the room. By dawn on the 20th of October 1330, the coup was complete. Mortimer was a prisoner. Isabella was confined to her apartments. The senior officers of the regime had either been arrested or had fled. The conspirators had control of the castle. The parliament that had been scheduled to consider the regime's finances now considered, instead, the new dispensation. The young king announced that he was assuming personal rule. The Standing Council was thanked for its service and dissolved. The Lords assembled in some confusion, but with general relief, accepted the change. By the end of the day, Edward III, at 17, was effectively King of England in fact as well as in name. Mortimer was conveyed to London under heavy guard, lodged in the Tower in the very rooms from which he had escaped in 1323, and tried before Parliament at Westminster in late November on charges of treason. The trial was a formality. He was denied the opportunity to speak in his own defence, as he had denied Hugh Despenser the younger 4 years before, as the Despensers had denied the Earl of Lancaster 10 years before that. He was convicted. He was sentenced to be drawn to Tyburn and hanged. The sentence was carried out on the 29th of November 1330. He was 43 years old. The body was left hanging at Tyburn for 2 days and was then taken down and given to the Grey Friars in London for burial. His widow Joan, who had been kept in custody for years and was now restored to her dower, received the body and buried him with the honours appropriate to his family. The charges against Mortimer at his trial were specific and severe. He was accused of having usurped royal power, of having drawn the young king away from his counsellors, of having engineered the death of Edward II at Berkeley, of having arranged the murder of the Earl of Kent in March 1330, of having taken to himself royal revenues that should have gone to the crown, of having maintained an unlawful retinue. The charge of having engineered the death of Edward II was the most politically explosive because it implicated his closest associate. Isabella was not herself charged with anything. She was not named in the indictment. She was not summoned to the trial. The young king, who had personally drafted the charges with his closest advisers, was careful to construct the indictment in such a way that all the responsibility fell on Mortimer alone. This was not because the king was naive about his mother's role. It was because he had decided, with the political sense that had been his mother's gift to him, that he would not arraign his mother in public. He would deal with her another way. The way he dealt with her was the way he had dealt with his father in 1327, by removing her from the centre of public life without putting her on trial. The arrangement that emerged from the council meetings of late November and early December 1330 was that Isabella's vast estates accumulated during her regime would be returned to the crown. Her dower as a Queen of England would be retained, at a reduced level commensurate with her widowed status. She would be given a comfortable residence. Castle Rising was selected after some discussion of alternatives, and she would be supported there at the crown's expense. She would not be permitted to leave the kingdom. She would not be permitted to return to court without express invitation. She would be honoured as Queen Mother in public ceremonies and on formal occasions. She would be, in everything but name, retired. The arrangement was generous by the standards of how losing parties in medieval English political coups were normally treated. It was severe by the standards of what Isabella herself had probably expected to keep, given that she had not been formally accused of any crime. It was, in retrospect, the right settlement, because it gave both her and her son the dignified separation that allowed them to be reconciled over the years that followed. Isabella, in the days following her son's coup, was kept at Berkhamsted Castle, then moved to Windsor, and then in the spring of 1331 conveyed to Castle Rising in Norfolk. She was 35 years old. She had been Queen of England for 19 years and Queen Mother for nearly 4. She had ruled the country for 3 of those years, and her lover had ruled it more than she had for the last of them. She had outlasted Gaveston and the Despensers and her husband, and now Mortimer. Her son had taken back the realm from her without a battle and without a charge against her personally, by the same political delicacy with which she had taken it from his father. There were no proceedings against her. There was no trial. She was not stripped of her dower. She was not even formally placed under arrest. She was simply, by an arrangement no one quite articulated, removed from the centre of public life. The question of what to do with the Queen Mother, who had deposed her husband and ruled his kingdom, was like the question of her husband's deposition itself, without precedent. The answer the young king devised, and applied with consistency for the rest of her life, was that she should be honoured, supported, and left in peace at one of the better royal castles, while the realm forgot, slowly and at its own pace, what she had done. Castle Rising. The name is older than the castle itself, drawn from the village that sat below the rock in the long marsh country of West Norfolk, where the Wash bites into the eastern coast of England and the rivers flow into salt creeks before they reach the sea. The castle had been built in the 1130s by William d'Aubigny, a Norman lord who had married a widowed Queen of England, and the great keep he raised on the rock above the marsh was one of the largest and most ornate Norman keeps in England, with carved stone springers, deep window seats in the thickness of its walls, and high vaulted halls that caught the long Norfolk light from the windows facing the sea. By Isabella's time, it had passed through several families and had reverted to the crown, and it was kept in good repair as one of the secondary royal castles of East Anglia, with a constable, a small garrison, and the kind of household establishment a noble guest could be lodged in without inconvenience. The young king assigned it to his mother in 1331 as her principal residence, with the formal grant of free movement within and around it, and with permission to maintain a full household at the crown's expense. She arrived in May 1331, with her women, her chaplains, her steward, her chamber officers, her wardrobe, her books, and the trunks of personal possessions that had followed her north from Windsor. She would not see the inside of the Tower of London again. She had 330 months left to live. The conditions of her residence at Castle Rising were comfortable. The young king saw to that. Her dower estates had not been touched. Her income was set at £3,000 a year, a substantial sum, larger than the income of any earl in England, and ample to maintain a queen's household. She had the use of the entire castle. She could ride out into the surrounding countryside. She could receive visitors who had the king's permission, which most of her surviving relatives received without difficulty. She kept her own staff, she kept her own confessor, she had her own falcons and hounds, and she hunted in the country round the castle as her health permitted. She had her own chapel in the keep, where she heard mass each morning. She had her own library, the books she had collected over the years, the romances she had loved since she was a girl in Paris, the religious treatises she had begun to accumulate in middle age, the chronicles that documented the history of the dynasty she belonged to. She read, she rode, she prayed, she wrote letters, she received reports. She lived, by every measure that mattered, the life of a senior noblewoman in a country house, which is what she now was. The image of Castle Rising as a prison was a later invention. The chroniclers who wrote about her in the years immediately after Mortimer's fall described her as withdrawn rather than imprisoned, and they used the word retreat more often than the word captivity. She was not free to leave the kingdom. She was not free to return to court without invitation. But she was free within those constraints to live as she chose, and the choices she made, books, hunting, religious patronage, the management of her estates by correspondence, were the choices of a woman who had been at the centre of European politics for a quarter of a century, and who was, at last, allowed to rest. The reconciliation with her son began almost at once. By the autumn of 1331, he was visiting her at Castle Rising. The visits were short at first and confined to family business, but they were warm. He had never publicly denounced her. He had never made any statement that implicated her in the death of his father or in any of the crimes for which Mortimer had been hanged. He had separated her, in the constitutional fiction he constructed, from the regime that had been blamed on Mortimer alone. The fiction was useful to both of them. It allowed her to be received at court without the embarrassment of a public penitent. It allowed him to honour his mother without endorsing what she had done. It was a delicate piece of family diplomacy, and it held for the next 27 years. By 1332, she was attending court for major ceremonial occasions. By 1334, she was being formally received at Windsor for Christmas. By the late 1330s, she was a regular presence at the great festivals, the Christmas courts, the Garter ceremonies, which her son founded in 1348, the betrothals and weddings of her grandchildren. She had her own apartments at Windsor and at Westminster, which she used when she came to court. She had a regular correspondence with the King and with the Queen Philippa, who had become over the years something like a daughter to her. She advised. She was consulted. She was honoured. She was, in the end, the Dowager Queen of England, and the realm came to terms with her in the slow, patient way that realms come to terms with figures whose pasts are too complicated for simple judgment. The years at Castle Rising fell into a rhythm. The household woke before dawn. The chamber women laid the fire and dressed the Queen. Mass was heard in the chapel at dawn. The first meal of the day was taken in the great chamber, with her senior officers in attendance. The morning was given to correspondence and to the business of her estates, which arrived in the form of letters and reports brought by messengers. The midday meal was the main meal of the day, taken with her women and any visitors of rank who happened to be present. The afternoon was given to riding when the weather permitted, or to reading in her chamber when it did not. The evening was given to music, to embroidery, to the entertainments of a noble household minstrels in the hall, the games of the chamber, the conversation of women who had been with her for years. Vespers was sung in the chapel. The evening meal was light. The chamber was retired to early. The candles were put out. The night silence was broken by the wind off the marshes and the cry of the geese on the wash. The Norfolk winters were long. The wind came inland off the sea, and the cold settled into the stone of the keep, and the household kept the great fires burning through the dark months from November through to March. Isabella, in her chamber on the upper floor of the keep, had the bed curtains drawn close around her bed at night against the draughts, and the women of her chamber slept in the adjoining rooms with the doors open in case she should call. The mornings in midwinter were dark until 8 o'clock. The candles burned long. The fires were never let to go out. The wind, when it was hard from the northwest, carried the salt of the wash inland and laid it on the windows of the keep. Her chamber on the upper floor of the keep was a room of substantial proportions, with 2 deep window embrasures cut through the thickness of the wall on the southern side, and a tall fireplace on the inner wall opposite. The bed was set against the inner wall, hung with curtains of green and blue figured silk, with linen sheets and a coverlet of marten fur for the colder months. A chest at the foot of the bed held her personal linen. A second chest under one of the windows held her jewels, which were managed by her chamberlain. A reading desk by the window held the book she was currently working through. A prayer stool stood by the inner wall before a panel painting of the crucifixion that had been with her since her marriage. The room smelled, in the winter, of wood smoke from the fire and beeswax from the candles and the herbs that her women threw onto the embers to scent the air. In the summer it smelled of the gardens below the keep, and the cut grass of the meadows, and the herbs that hung in bunches from the beam over the chimney. It was a chamber. It was a room a noble woman of her century would have recognized. It was the room she lived the last 27 years of her life in, and it was the room she went home to whenever she had been away. The summers were the other thing. The Norfolk coast in midsummer is one of the more beautiful pieces of the English landscape, and the marshes around Castle Rising in June and July were a country of long evenings, slow rivers, wildflowers in the verges, herons on the saltings. The light in midsummer lasted until 10 o'clock and beyond, and she would ride out in the long evenings with her women and the master of her household, through the lanes of the village and out into the country towards the sea. She had been raised in Paris and had spent her queenship at the great houses of southern England, and Norfolk was new country for her. She came to know it well through the long stretch of her residence. The villages of Sainte-Chapelle and Hunstanton and Wolferton along the coast became familiar to her. The market days at Lynn, 12 miles to the south on the Great House, were attended by her officers and sometimes by her in person. She knew, by the late 1340s, the country round her castle as she had once known the country round Eltham and Woodstock. The grandchildren came in regular succession. Edward III and Philippa produced 12 children across their long marriage, of whom 7 survived to adulthood. Isabella's first grandchild, the Black Prince, was the firstborn, that infant of Woodstock, who had been 4 months old when she went to Castle Rising. He grew up to be one of the great soldiers of his century, the commander at Crécy in 1346, when he was 16, and at Poitiers in 1356, when he was 26. And his grandmother watched his career from her castle with the kind of pride that survives political eclipse. He visited her at Castle Rising when his campaigns allowed. He wrote to her when they did not. Isabella of Woodstock, her granddaughter named for her, was a visitor of long standing. So were Lionel of Antwerp, John of Gaunt, Edmund of Langley, and the others as they reached the age at which they could travel. The next generation of the English royal family treated her as one of the senior members of the family, and she received them as such. Her great-grandchildren, born across the 1340s and 1350s, included Richard II, the boy who would later succeed his grandfather as king. The library at Castle Rising, which has been partly reconstructed from her household accounts and her will, was a substantial one by the standards of any private collection of the period. She had the great romances of her century, the Roman de Perse Forest, a long Arthurian compilation that had been written for her own household and her brothers, the Lancelot in its prose recension, the Roman de la Rose, which was the great love poem of 14th century France and which she had read since girlhood. She had religious works, psalters with the elaborate illumination that the French and English ateliers of her century produced, books of hours that she had commissioned from her own scribes, lives of the saints, particularly the saints of her own family and of her dynasty. She had chronicles, Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, which the medieval English took seriously as history, the Chronicle of Sigebert of Gembloux, which covered the affairs of the German emperors, the Great Chronicle of Saint Denis, which her father had patronized and which traced the kings of France from their legendary origins to her own century. She had practical books, a copy of the Treasure of Brunetto Latini, which was an encyclopedia of the political wisdom of the age, treatises on falconry, which was the great noble pastime, medical treatises, which her physician used. The collection grew across her residence at Castle Rising. The household accounts show regular payments to scribes and illuminators for new manuscripts, and the will she made in 1358 distributed a substantial library among her son, her grandchildren, and the religious houses she had favoured. The household at Castle Rising was, by the late 1330s, in a settled pattern. The senior women of her chamber were ladies who had been with her for many years. Joan Jermy, who had attended her since the 1320s, was the chief lady of the bedchamber. Several others had joined her in the years after her arrival in Norfolk. The chamberlain of her household was Sir Oliver de Ingham, who had served her since the days of the regime in 1327, and who remained in her service until his death in 1344. Her steward was Sir John Maltravers, who had been one of the principal officers of the regime, and who, after the fall of Mortimer, had been pardoned through Isabella's intervention and restored to her service. Her physician was a Frenchman, Master Pancius de Controne, who had been with her since the time of her invasion and who attended her until his own death in the early 1350s. The continuity of the household across decades was a deliberate choice. She did not replace her people. She kept them. She paid them well from her own income. She gave them lands and offices when she could. And she was rewarded with their long loyalty, which carried her through the kind of withdrawal that most women of her rank, removed from court, found harder than she did in 1336. A private grief struck her that was, by every account, harder than anything the politics had ever produced. Her second son, John of Eltham, who had been the small boy born at Eltham Palace in 1316, died at Perth in September 1336, during the Scottish campaign he was conducting on his elder brother's behalf. He was 20 years old. He had not married. He had been, by every account, a thoughtful and competent young man who had grown into the standard role of a royal younger son with more grace than most. The cause of his death was, according to the chronicles, a fever, although some accounts suggested he had been killed in a quarrel with his elder brother, a suggestion that the historians of the period have generally rejected as malicious gossip. His body was conveyed south from Perth to London, where he was buried in Westminster Abbey under a fine tomb that his mother and brother together paid for. Isabella attended the funeral. She wore the mourning her position required. She gave the gifts to religious houses for the soul of her dead son. She returned to Castle Rising in the late autumn of 1336, a woman who had been brought, by this loss, into a different relation to her own life. The boy who had been born at Eltham, in the green palace she had loved most among her houses, had not lived long enough to take up the inheritance she had imagined for him. The household accounts at Castle Rising for the months that followed show extra payments to her chaplains for additional masses for the dead. She would, across the rest of her life, found a perpetual chantry for his soul at Westminster. She was a regular figure at the great court occasions across the 1340s. She attended the foundation of the Order of the Garter at Windsor in April 1348. The new chivalric order her son had created to celebrate the recent victories in France, with its Blue Garter motto in French and its company of 26 knights, of which the Black Prince was the founding member. She was at the Great Garter tournament that followed the foundation, where she watched her grandson, the prince, and his companions joust with the senior magnates of the realm. She corresponded with her former daughter-in-law, Joan of the Tower, who had become Queen of Scots and who occasionally found ways to reach her mother over the political distance. She corresponded with the Queen of France, the daughter-in-law of her brother Charles IV's successor. She maintained the network of European royal connections that had been built around her since girlhood, even from her Norfolk castle, by the regular dispatch of letters and gifts. The household accounts at Castle Rising show, among the routine entries for candles and wine and cloth, the steady cost of messengers and gifts to the courts of Europe, year after year, across decades. The 100 Years' War, which began in 1337, when her son claimed the throne of France through her, was one of the great backdrops of her later life. It was, in a sense, her war. The claim that started it was her claim, the inheritance of the French crown that had come to her by the deaths of her three brothers without male heirs, and that her son was now pressing as her successor. The Salic law of France, which had been invoked to bar her own succession in 1328, and which barred Edward's claim now, was a legal innovation that her own son did not accept. The war that resulted would last, with interruptions, for over a century. Isabella did not live to see most of it, but the great early victories, Sluys in 1340, Crécy in 1346, the siege and surrender of Calais in 1347, were victories she lived through and received reports of, and she understood, as few people in England understood, exactly what they meant. The Calais campaign was the one most associated with her in the popular memory of the period. Queen Philippa was at the camp with the king for the siege, and the famous scene at the surrender of the town, Philippa on her knees before her husband to plead for the lives of the 6 burghers, was reported across Europe almost at once. Isabella, in her chamber at Castle Rising, would have read the report. She would have approved of her daughter-in-law's mercy. She would have understood, perhaps better than anyone else alive, what it had cost the Queen of England to make the scene happen. The Black Death reached England in the summer of 1348. It moved north and east through the autumn and winter and reached its peak in the early summer of 1349. It killed, by the best modern estimates, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of the country. The royal family was not exempt. Joan of the Tower, Isabella's youngest daughter, who had married David Bruce in 1328 and become Queen of Scots, was not in England at the time and survived. But Joan of England, granddaughter, daughter of Edward III, betrothed to the Prince of Castile, was sent to Bordeaux that summer to be conveyed onward to Castile for her marriage, and she died of plague at Bayonne on the 2nd of July 1348. She was 14 years old. The grief in the royal family was severe. Isabella, who had loved this granddaughter and had been involved in the negotiations for her marriage, mourned her in the formal style appropriate to her rank and in the private way that meant the more. The plague went on through 1349 and into 1350. The country was, by the end of it, a different country. Castle Rising itself lost servants and tenants. The village below the castle was reduced. The Norfolk monasteries that lay in the country around were reduced. The world that had been Isabella's world for 50 years was beginning to disassemble around her, and she watched it go with the steady attention of a woman who had outlived too much to be surprised by any of it. The last decade of her life was spent moving more freely between Castle Rising and Hertford Castle in the south, with frequent visits to Windsor and Westminster for the great court occasions. Hertford was a smaller property than Castle Rising, but closer to the centre of things, and as she grew older, she found the journey from Norfolk increasingly tiring. By the early 1350s, she was spending half the year at Hertford and only the warmer months at Rising. She was in her late 50s now. Her health was beginning to decline. Her sight was failing. She had a book of devotions made for her in larger script, which survives in part. Her movement was stiffer. She had outlived her 3 brothers, her husband, her lover, 2 of her 4 children, and the world she had been born into. She had not outlived her son, who was now in his 40s and at the height of his power, or her daughter-in-law Philippa, who at 50 was still Queen of England, or her grandchildren, who were the leading members of the next generation. The grandchildren visited her more often as she grew older and could travel less herself. The Black Prince, between his French campaigns, made the journey to Hertford whenever he was in England. He was now in his 20s, a tall, fair-haired man, with the build of his grandfather Philip the Fair, and his grandmother, who had only the vaguest memories of her own father by now, saw the family resemblance and remarked on it. John of Gaunt, who was 13 years younger than the prince, and who would in time become one of the great political figures of late 14th century England, was a regular visitor as a young man. He had been born at Ghent in 1340, when his mother had accompanied his father on campaign, and he had been raised partly at Eltham, which was a connection his grandmother appreciated. Edmund of Langley, born in 1341, and Thomas of Woodstock, born in 1355, were both in regular correspondence with her household. Isabella of Woodstock, her namesake granddaughter, was the closest of all to her. They had developed, across the visits of the granddaughter's adolescence, the kind of bond between an old woman and a young one that runs on a different rhythm from the bond between mothers and daughters. The granddaughter would marry late in her life, in 1365, after Isabella was dead, and she would name her own first daughter Philippa for the queen, not Isabella for the grandmother, which was perhaps a piece of family politics that the old queen would have recognised and accepted with the same composure she had shown across her life. The household at Hertford in the 1350s was smaller than the household at Castle Rising had been in the 1330s. Some of the old retainers had died, some had retired. The new entries in her wardrobe accounts were for younger people of less distinguished name. The economies of an old queen mother in the last years of her life are smaller economies than the economies of a queen mother in her prime. She gave less, she moved less, she read more. The household ordinances of these years describe a court that began the day later and ended it earlier than the courts of her earlier residences. The fires were kept burning in her chamber longer in the autumn and lit earlier in the spring. Her chaplains were instructed to keep the morning office shorter when she could not attend. Her physicians attended her more often. The small, slow constrictions of an old life were settling around her. She did not, as far as the chronicles record, become melancholy. She had never been a melancholy person, and old age did not change that. She received visitors, she corresponded with her son, she gave audiences, she wrote letters. She kept up the family business that any senior member of a royal house has, to keep up the births and marriages of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the deaths of old friends, the management of religious foundations, the disposition of plate and lands and gifts. She remained, in the working sense, Queen Mother of England, and the realm continued to treat her as such. The young King Richard, who was born in 1367, 9 years after her death, would not know her. But the senior members of the family in the 1350s knew her, and they treated her with the affection that long service to a complicated woman tends to produce in those who survive the difficulty. In the summer of 1358, she fell ill at Hertford. The illness was not specified in detail by any of the chroniclers, but the descriptions suggest something gradual rather than acute, a slow decline of an old body that had been carrying its mortality for some time. She was 63 years old. She made her will in the early weeks of August. She received the last rites from her confessor on the 21st of August. She died at Hertford Castle on the 22nd of August 1358. The room was the upper chamber of the castle, with the bed curtains drawn and the women of her chamber around her. The fire was lit, though the August evening was warm. The candles were burning. She had been Queen of England for 50 years and 3 months, the longest queenship of any English queen consort to that date. Her will specified that she should be buried at the Church of the Grey Friars at Newgate in London, where Mortimer was buried. She also specified that she should be buried in her wedding mantle, the cloak she had worn at Boulogne in January 1308, when she was 13 years old and being married to Edward II. The mantle had been preserved among her possessions for 50 years. It was sent to Greyfriars with her body. She also asked that a casket containing her dead husband's heart, which had been preserved at her instruction since his funeral in 1327, should be placed on her breast in the coffin. The request was carried out. The funeral was held at Greyfriars on the 27th of November 1358, 3 months after her death, the delay being normal for royal funerals in the period, which required time for the arrangements to be made. The young king, who was now 46 years old, attended in person. Queen Philippa attended. The Black Prince attended. The senior nobility and clergy of England attended. The body of the Queen, who had deposed her husband and ruled in her son's name, was buried in the Franciscan church in Newgate, with the full honours appropriate to a Queen of England. Her tomb was destroyed in the dissolution of the monasteries 2 centuries later, and Greyfriars itself was burned in the Great Fire of London in 1666. There is no monument to her in London today, and no surviving image of her that can be relied upon as a likeness. The image of her that has come down to us is the image the later chroniclers gave her: the she-wolf, the murderess of her husband, the woman whose adultery and ambition wrecked a kingdom. The image is not accurate. She was not called the she-wolf in her lifetime. The name was attached to her by Thomas Gray, the English poet, in the 18th century, 400 years after her death, and it has stuck because it is memorable and because it suits a certain way of thinking about women who exercise power. The Isabella, who actually lived, was a more complicated figure. She was a French princess raised by remarkable parents to think of queenship as a working office. She was married at 13 to a man who could not love her and who allowed her to be publicly insulted and privately impoverished for nearly 2 decades. She bore that husband 4 children. She endured 18 years of marginalization. When she finally moved against him, she did it with the political skill that had been trained into her by her parents and with the support of most of the English political class, and she ruled the country reasonably well in her son's name until her partner overreached and her son took the realm back from her. She lived another 28 years in comfortable retirement, was reconciled to her son, watched her grandchildren grow up, and died at 63 in her bed with the women of her chamber around her. She was buried in her wedding cloak. She was buried with her husband's heart on her breast. Whether that gesture was love or guilt, or some more complicated thing that those 2 words do not catch, no one will now ever know. The marshes round Castle Rising are still there. The keep is still there, in better repair than most Norman keeps of its age, kept as an ancient monument by the English government. You can walk through the rooms in which she lived. You can climb the staircase she climbed. You can stand at the window of what is believed to have been her chamber and look out across the same flat country towards the sea, where the same gulls come inland, off the same wash, and the wind comes off the same coast, and the long Norfolk light falls on the same stones it has been falling on for nearly 900 years. The woman who lived in those rooms has been dead for more than 600 years. The story we have been telling tonight is the story of her life from the first hour to the last. It is the story of a girl raised in a palace on the Isle de la Cite in Paris in the 1290s, who was Queen of England by 13, mother by 17, a deposer of a king by 31, ruler of a kingdom by 32, dispossessed by 35, retired by force to a castle in Norfolk by 36, and dead in her bed at 63, having outlasted nearly everyone who had shaped her century. She was called many things. She did many things. She lived a long life that was as full as any life of her age, and she ended it with the quiet that her age rarely granted its loudest figures. What she left behind, beyond the buildings and the tomb that no longer survives, was a son. Edward III reigned for another 19 years after her death. He won, in those years, the second great battle of the Hundred Years' War at Poitiers in 1356, and the temporary peace of Bretigny in 1360. He outlived his wife Philippa, who died in 1369. He outlived the Black Prince, who died of dysentery, contracted on the Spanish campaign in 1376. He lived long enough to see his realm decline from the peak of his own middle years into the troubled last decade of his life. He died at Sheen Palace on the 21st of June 1377, aged 64, a year older than his mother had been when she died at Hertford 19 years before. He was buried at Westminster Abbey next to his wife and his son. The crown passed to his 10-year-old grandson Richard II, who would be deposed in his turn in 1399 by his cousin Henry of Bolingbroke. Another political coup in which a Queen of England, Isabella, had pioneered would be applied again, with the same combination of legal theology and political pressure. The constitutional precedents of 1327, the formal deposition of a king by Parliament, the language of the renunciation, the abdication ceremony, would be applied to Richard II in 1399, to Henry VI in the 1460s, to Edward IV briefly in 1470, to Charles I much later in 1649. The procedure Isabella's regime had invented to remove her husband became, over the centuries, part of the constitutional inheritance of the English crown. She did not, when she invented it, intend it to become so. She was solving a particular problem of her own marriage. But she had been raised by Philip the Fair, and she did the work of legal invention in the manner he had taught her, and the legal invention was good enough to be used again. That, perhaps more than anything else, is what her life amounted to in the long historical view. She had taught the English political class how to depose a king. That, I think, is the right place to leave her. Not in the chamber at Nottingham, not in the great hall at Westminster, not on the beach at Orwell. In the upper room at Hertford, with the women of her chamber around the bed, with the candles burning low and the wedding cloak folded on the chest at the foot of the bed, and her last hour coming slowly through the long August evening. She has had her 700 years of name. She is allowed, in the small private hour that closes any life, to be a woman in her bed, going to sleep at last. Wherever you are listening from tonight, I want to thank you for being here. If you've made it this far, you've walked with one of the most extraordinary women of the medieval period, from her first hours to her last. Across a life of 63 years and 3 kingdoms and 4 reigns and one of the great transformations of the English crown. I'd love to know where you ended up listening from. Leave it in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to be there for the next one, please do subscribe. Every subscriber helps the channel grow, and there are many more lives like this one waiting to be told. Sleep well. The candles are out, the wind is up, the chamber is quiet. Good night.